The consequences of AI going wrong are severe.
We need an integrated approach between AI and workers' knowledge.
The upsides here are tremendous.
Technology is transforming our world at unprecedented speeds.
This is a Darwinian period.
It's changing our lives, challenging our job security, our educational and financial systems, and impacting our planet faster than we expected. Artificial intelligence is capable of incredible achievements. It can create efficiencies, spur innovation, mimic reality, bring nostalgia to life.
How can I even try to go on?
But AI can also have a dark side, rooted in distrust and disinformation. How we use it is up to us. Can this powerful new technology help solve the world's greatest challenges? This is the Bloomberg Technology Summit.
Please welcome to the stage Bloomberg's Caroline Hyde and Bloomberg's Brad Stone.
Good morning, London. I'm Brad Stone, Senior Executive Editor for Global Technology at Bloomberg.
And I'm Caroline Hyde. I'm an anchor at Bloomberg TV, and I'm lucky enough to help present the Daily Technology Show. And welcome one and all, those in front of us in the audience in real life, and those who are joining us virtually as well.
Our theme for today is solving global challenges. Now, Caroline, do you ever notice at tech conferences, they seem to be a kind of rumination on problems, the challenges of AI, the impact of social media on our well-being, on our politics, geopolitical tensions.
They're pretty down a lot of the time.
Well, we decided for today we're going to try to focus on solutions.
Okay, I like that. Actionable solutions. Actually, we want you to have purposeful conversation, interact with us, listen to an incredible array of experts, of CEOs, of thought leaders, but really taking away things they can go with purpose and enact within their company, within their policy making, with you at home as well. And we also want to give the global context here. For many, you are sat dedicating your time to listen and hear from experts on a time where our hearts are heavy, We are currently worried about conflict in the Middle East. And with that, we want to thank you in particular for dedicating some time to us today.
Yeah, there certainly is a lot on our minds right now. We know there's a lot on your minds, but we also recognize that this is a community that likes to build. And so one of the things that we're very excited about today is unveiling our inaugural Top 25 UK Startups to Watch list. And those are companies in consumer technology, fintech, semiconductors, health tech, and climate tech. And we'll be unveiling the list this afternoon, so everybody should stay around.
Definitely.
We also want you to be part of the conversations today. We're going to invite you to send in your questions, and we'll do our best to get to as many as we can. You can do that by scanning the QR code printed behind your badges, and it's also up here on the screen. And you'll also be able to find the Wi-Fi information here.
Necessary.
And we're also going to be polling you. Every session's going to have a poll. In fact, why don't we kick it off right now with a poll. Where will AI have the most impact? Healthcare, space, climate change, manufacturing, or entertainment? And Caroline, as folks scan the QR code and submit their vote, where would you place your bet here?
For me personally, I mean, the amount of experts we're having on the show talk about it, but also all of us have been through a global pandemic. We are thinking about our own families touched by cancer and many an healthcare situation. I really hope AI is a great driver of innovation within the world of health.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer, particularly for the UK tech community, healthcare. The topic of our next panel is climate change, so I want to be an optimist and hope that AI makes an impact there as well.
Thus far, I'm winning. Thank you for aligning yourself with me today. But healthcare, clearly, front and center, that is where many people are really feeling that some of the changes are going to be made here. I also think you've got to remember, I rather liked it that everyone got their phones out and started taking pictures. Do that throughout. We are a tech summit. Technology front and center, therefore get on social media, share some of your thoughts, your learnings throughout the day. It is #BloombergTech.
And we should probably thank our sponsors.
Thanks for nudging me there. I want you to come in from the delicious coffee that you're probably getting from our wonderful providing sponsors today. EY has got the coffee flowing. We've got also Google, Chrome Enterprise to thank as well, and they've got an interactive experience to go if you're here in real life. But we do thank, of course, the companies that have been helping put on this entire event for us today.
And with that, let's get started.
Please welcome to the stage Samir Aboud, CEO at Innergy, Raphael Leyendecker, Managing Director of Techstars Sustainability Paris, and Bart Marcus, Chairman of First Light Fusion, for a conversation with Bloomberg's John Fra.
Thank you, Brad and Caroline. Thank you all again for coming today. So we're going to be hearing a lot today about how technology can help us work better, think better, build better. But we want to kick off today by asking how technology can solve the biggest challenge facing humanity, climate change. And there's no stretch of the imagination to say that this is a case where technology really can save humanity. So that's what we want to dig into today. We all know about the amazing leaps that have been made in solar and wind and batteries over the last 20 years. But those technologies are not enough. What are the frontier technologies that can reach the parts of the economy that those technologies can't reach? How does AI play a role in that? And most importantly, where is the money for all of this going to come from? So as this is a Bloomberg conference, let's start with the money angle. Raphael, I'll start with you. I mean, I think we have a chart actually to pop up on screen. So we started the year with this huge optimism that we would see this wall of money coming into clean tech. We had the Inflation Reduction Act, the European Green Deal, et cetera. But as you can see on the chart, that hasn't quite transpired. VC money has not flowed as much as we would have thought. Now, a lot of that might be down to rising interest rates, geopolitical tensions, et cetera. But it does sort of seem to sort of temper some of the optimism that we saw at the start of the year. Raphael, from where you sit, you run an investment fund for startups. Are you seeing that? Should we be concerned?
Well, to be honest, in the last 2 years, we invested in 48 companies from Paris in the sustainability field. And I believe it's a great place to be. Definitely, well, you were showcasing some numbers on climate, and definitely there's been a burst maybe, but the VC downturn is slowing down investment in every category of the venture world. Climate, I think, is attracting more and more interest. It's a fact. In Europe, we have great regulation, Article 8, Article 9 funding. If some funds are struggling to raise, the climate tech is definitely performing pretty well. We have seen that on growth stage, it's actually doing really well. I think you have Northvolt talking during the day. Vercor is a great also French company in the field. We have Climework in Europe. So I think it's really dynamic, and especially at the early stage, we have such an amazing opportunity, well, from the French perspective, but also in Europe again, having subsidies and grants to help the founders do a great job. So definitely, I think we can learn from the mistake of the first clean tech burst. And we see that technologies such as carbon capture with the CCUS and DAC are actually growing in the interest of VCs. So I believe that maybe the interest is shifting from software to hardware, and investor, just like us at the pre-seed, really early stage, are gearing up to help founder from a tech perspective to speed up their tech roadmap.
And before we get to Bart, I mean, you mentioned carbon capture. Are there any other areas within clean tech that where you are seeing a huge appetite right now?
Yeah, definitely. I guess. Well, we'll talk a bit about nuclear. This is also where smaller side projects are actually attracting a lot of interest from the early stage, even if well, the length of investment is still pretty long. Circular economy has done a lot of things happening, whether it's about waste management, but also just upcycling and actually having network effects. And definitely water industry. We still see too few companies. Often they're related to utilities, but so many cool investment on the field. I can only recommend looking at a great company we have called Cumulus, creating water out of the air. I guess this is the kind of infrastructure startups that are attracting more and more interest from the VC side, where before they were more, talking to private equity firms or project financing, and now we're seeing that, well, they're going much faster to the market, and actually even those asset-heavy companies can be really successful on the tech scene.
Thank you. Bart, let me turn to you. We're going to talk, you're chairman of one of the most interesting nuclear fusion companies around, and we'll get into the technology of that in a moment. But you describe yourself as a geek-turned-business guy. I think you said you've launched 6 companies or so. This is a UK tech conference. So I wanted just to sort of start by asking you, how would you describe the investment environment or the business climate right now in the UK for clean tech startups such as yours?
Yeah, and so maybe I relate it specifically to fusion. So the UK, of course, has had a very prominent role in fusion in the past decade. So there's at Cullen, the UK AEA, Atomic Energy Authority, has a facility called the Joint European Torus, which is the origin of what is now being built in the south of France of ITER. So it's got a very, very strong legacy in nuclear fusion. Now, all of that has been magnetically confined fusion. The picture everyone has seen, if you've seen the movie Passengers, right? It's like the donut-shaped thing that goes around. And I think there's a new type of fusion that's starting to take the lead, I would argue, inertia-confined fusion, which is what, again, in Oxford, the company I chair, First Light Fusion, that comes out of Oxford University, does. So there's a really strong ecosystem there. And I think from a environment perspective, I'm sure you've seen a couple of weeks ago, the UK government has announced a £650 million further funding into fusion to retain that lead position. A lot of that money is going to go, no doubt, to magnetically confined fusion, as it should, because there's a lot of effort that's gone in there in the past. But we're obviously having a lot of discussions to make sure that it's not just MCF, but also inertia confined fusion that will get its part. And it's a very supportive environment. And if I can relate to your question of the IRA in the US, I think we should not forget that the IRA actually is predominantly, actually solely, I would argue, funding deployment, and it doesn't fund technology. And so there is, however, in the US, in particular on fusion, there's also really substantial funding. The US has $1 billion allocated to the sector in research funding to get these things to become power plants. So,
later on, we'll talk about all of the leaps that we've seen coming out of the US over the last year. We've talked about the money and the investment climate. I now want to sort of dig into the technologies. Before I talk to Samir, we have a poll that we want to show you. I think you can on your phones. And the question is, where do you see the best returns in clean investment over the next decade? Solar, wind, carbon capture, geothermal, fusion, or green hydrogen? As I say, you can vote on your phones, and we'll get back to the results. Hopefully, it will be displayed in real time on screen as the conversation goes on. So
only 1 decade.
Here we go. Green hydrogen is racing ahead. As the votes come in, I think, Samir, you were going to be your job here is to persuade the audience here about the virtues of geothermal. So you say that this is going to be the decade of geothermal. Why is that?
Yeah, I truly believe that that's the case. So we've seen for the last 10 years that there's been a huge focus on electricity, on power. There's been a huge focus on wind and solar, and rightfully so. We need as much wind and solar as possible. But I think that what we are seeing now is that the big elephant in the room is actually heating. If we look at heating in Europe, 50% of all the energy we consume in Europe is for heating and cooling. And by far, most of that is for heating of our houses. And if we then look at that, then 70% of all that energy today comes from burning fossil fuel. So if we want to reach our climate goals, we need to do something about heating. And I really think that that is the big topic right now in Brussels, in Germany, in France, in many of the European countries, that they see that we also need to focus on heating. And I think that that's the reason why geothermal has such a huge potential when we look at the future. Because if you look at heating, then geothermal has been around for hundreds of years, and that's primarily been used for producing electricity. But there, if you want to do electricity from geothermal, then you need plus 300 degrees water, and it's not everywhere that you have that. But actually, if you just want to do heating in combination, together with district heating, you only need water like 40 to 50 degrees hot, and you have that across Europe. So you actually have a huge market for this. You basically just have to have 2 maps. One map that you put on top of each other, one map of all the water reservoirs in Europe, which are between 40 to 80 degrees. And we know where they are, because for hundreds of years we've been drilling thousands of wells trying to find oil and gas. And normally, if we didn't find oil and gas, we found lukewarm water, which we couldn't use for anything up until now. So you basically have that map over Europe, and then on top of that, you put the map of the district heating systems in Europe, and then you see a huge potential, a huge market for geothermal for heating. And I think that that's a completely different case from doing geothermal for power, where you need much hotter water, and it's much more difficult to find these reservoirs. So that's the reason why I think that we are entering into the decade of geothermal, because heating is going to be such a huge part of the green transition, and geothermal can be such a great part of transitioning heating from fossil fuel to green energy.
And can you explain to the audience that we talked about this when we talked last week, just the sort of the physics and the engineering of geothermal? What's the lowest point that you need to dig down before How deep do you need to go before it stops being economically viable to get all that hot water out of the Earth's crust?
So that depends very much on the different city that you're going into, but basically this is known technology. So we've been in oil and gas for 50 years, and this is what we've been doing for 50 years. When you are producing oil, you normally get a lot of water as well. In the North Sea, when we're producing oil, you get 70% water. Then you separate the water from the oil, and then you mix more water in, and you send it back into the reservoir. This is much simpler. You have one production well where you are taking up the hot water, and then you harvest the heat, and you send the water back again. So very, very simple technology. The new thing is that there is a market for heating in Europe. And normally we would say that you need 40 to 50 degrees. That's kind of the lowest point in respect to where it makes sense to harvest the heat from the reservoirs beneath. But it also depends a little bit on the cost of doing the wells. But in many of the large cities, what is the benefit is the fact that the footprint is very small. So a geothermal plant is around 20 by 20 meters, so you can fit it into each parks in large cities. And that's often the problems in large cities. How are you going to convert into green heating in the large cities? And their geothermal has a really, really small footprint and can be used. So in many of these cities, you can maybe even go further down in temperature than the 40 to 50 degrees.
We're in London, so what, 3 kilometers or so? Is that how far down you'd need to go?
I think London, the focus on London is on this transition that we are seeing, that for many years we've been using gas as heating. So nobody have really thought about it because you have these gas pipelines, and we've had, for many, many years, had cheap gas from Russia, and that time is over now, and we need to find a different way to heat our houses and cities by burning gas. And I think that the answer to that is rolling out more district heating. We're seeing that in Brussels, we're seeing that in Europe, we're seeing that in Germany, in Poland, that you're rolling out more district heating. And that could be a solution for London, that you roll out district heating in London, and then you have a raft of different energy sources, heat sources, that can tap into this heating infrastructure that you build. It could be surplus heat from carbon capture, from power to X. It could be surplus heat from waste incineration. It could be from geothermal as well, but it could be a mix. But if you have that infrastructure for heating, then suddenly you have a vast amount of green heating sources that you can put into that infrastructure, and thereby get rid of the fossil fuel for heating of the houses in London.
Thank you. Bart, let me turn to you. So a year ago, nearly a year ago, the world was set alight by headlines coming out of California from the National Ignition Facility, stating that the holy grail of nuclear fusion had been achieved net energy gain, i.e., and I'm sure I'll get the physics wrong here, but essentially you use energy to smash two...
More energy out than in.
Correct. When you're fusing together a hydrogen nuclide. This is the opposite, for those of you who've seen Oppenheimer, this is the opposite of the Trinity test, of course, which is fission, this is fusion. Can you tell us a little bit, so that was the big story a year ago, how have things evolved since then?
Yeah, so it was the National Ignition Facility, Lawrence Livermore, achieved, actually what they achieved is just what the name says, what's on the tin, ignition, meaning that they were able to ignite the fuel so it self-heats, and that actually theoretically allows you to get to much higher gain than where they are today. And so they were able to do that with inertia-confined fusion.
Which is the same technology as yours.
That's what we're doing too. We just have a simpler way of getting there. They have a lot, actually you see on the picture here, so we have a little target, as we call it, which is this thing out here, and then we fire a projectile at it from one direction. This is so anyone that wants to see it in real life, find me for a coffee, and I'll show you. And what we do is we then wrap that pressure that we create around a fuel capsule, the identical fuel capsule that's used at Lawrence Livermore, and we make that collapse. And then when you collapse it, you get huge pressure, and then you create the energy that creates that reaction, and that NIF has now shown can actually create what's called ignition, so that the fuel in itself starts to burn. Fuel burn is also what people call it. That's the first time we've done ignition with fusion for energy generation. Obviously, we've seen ignition in fusion in different applications, right, in weapons applications. But and magnetically confined fusion is at this point at 0.7x in terms of gain. The Lawrence Livermore guys, they've repeated that experiment and of course are climbing up the ladder. So they're at 1.9 times now with ignition shown. So my bet, which I became part of First Light 7 years ago, so my bet was 7 years ago, was that inertia confined fusion was going to win the day, and at least I think today it looks very promising. Now what we, I think as this country, and I consider myself from this perspective be part of this country, we need to make sure that we don't let the Americans eat our lunch here, because they actually spent $4 billion on a facility in Lawrence Livermore. They have Sandia Labs just down the road, which is also working on inertia confined fusion, whereas actually the private company that's the lead by far is First Light Fusion in Oxford. So I think we've got a real opportunity to not just be the leader in magnetically confined fusion, which I think the UK is, but also remain, from a private company perspective, the lead in inertia confined fusion. That's what we're fighting to make happen.
And of course, this has been one of the most exciting developments in physics and energy of the last.
Totally, the geek in me loves it.
Exactly. But can you talk to us a little bit?
Didn't study physics for no reason, after all.
Can you talk to us about the roadmap to commercial deployment? Of course, it's one thing being able to prove you can do this in the lab.
Yeah, if you saw that,
completely different story.
Yeah. So when you get the physics of fusion to work, so you get the energy coming out, and again, let's also be super honest about this and transparent. So we're talking about gain at a fuel level. So we're not talking about the efficiency of, in our case, launching a projectile. In the case of Lawrence Livermore, firing. And I was there 3 weeks ago, and I walked the facility with Ed Moses, the guy that actually built it. And there's 192 lasers. It's 5 American football fields in size, cost $4 billion to build, and so it's beyond imagination. Then you go to First Light in Oxford. It's still, it's not like my work shed, which I'm very proud of too, by the way. But so it's a lot more complex than that. But it's nowhere near the complexity of what they are doing there. So that I think is where we have a real advantage. It's a much simpler technology, and that also allows us to take it into a power plant in a much simpler way. Because instead of coming at it from 192 different angles to get that spherical implosion that you need to have, we actually come at it from one angle. And then what we do is we are able to wrap that shockwave around the fuel capsule and make it implode as if there was a spherical shockwave coming from all angles. And so in the end, if you look at First Light, we've got 100 people, and the largest group of people in there are, as Nick Hawker, the founder, always says, I basically got a block which is about an inch by an inch by an inch, and I can do in there whatever I choose to do. And so we've got a group of people doing simulation to simulate these targets before we actually fire them, using, I think there was a question that was there earlier, we have a lot of AI that we use because it becomes super complex, a lot of different simulations that we run. For every experiment we fire on average, for every experiment that we fire, we run on average 2,000 simulations on our own cluster in Oxford, actually.
I want to get the investment perspective from Raphael in a moment, but just very quickly, how many years?
You're going to invest, Raphael?
This is the pitch.
You're too far along for us.
Very quickly, sorry, before we... how many years? Your best guess before we see commercial deployment? 10, 20, 30?
So I think that there's about 6 credible approaches to fusion in private companies. It's going to come from a private company, right? It's not going to come from one of the national laboratories. They're not even targeting to do that. They all have a timeline that's similar. I mean, some are more aggressive in what they communicate, but in the end, it's all at some point it's early 30s, and then some things will go wrong. So, but our timeline is 32. We'll have the first power plant on the grid, which is going to generate, you can charge your iPhone with energy coming from fusion. Isn't that cool?
Very cool. Raphael, what's the investment perspective on fusion? Obviously, a lot of talk about it, a lot of excitement about it. Are you seeing a lot of appetite to put money into fusion?
Yeah, definitely. We are participating to a big event actually on the nuclear energy topic in Paris in the coming months. We invested also in a company called NDB Technologies, recycling radioactive waste to create...
Fusion does not generate any radioactive waste out of the reaction, right, to be clear. So that's the differentiation between fission and fusion. There's no... The product of the reaction is neutron and a helium core, and the helium, we've got 2% around us, right?
I guess this is a great topic, but we've been talking a lot about renewable energy, and I think there is also going to be a change of paradigm, typically going from centralized way of producing energy to a mix of different solutions. And not only about energy production, but also about, I was talking about waste management, talking about water, all the utilities. And so, well, definitely, personally, my target as an investor is how do we solve climate change? We have less than 20 years remaining. Big ambition when it comes to lowering the rays of heating on our planet. And I strongly believe that there were some lines missing on the poll you sent to the audience. And definitely, well, talking about batteries, yes, solar, wind is going to help us get more electricity on the grid. But then how do we manage the grid? How do we do peer-to-peer? How do we do better charging system for our cars and our homes? So I'm not a specialist about nuclear. I invest in a wide range of companies. I told you, 48 companies within 2 years. We have great specialists working with our founders. But definitely, I think this kind of the problem we want to solve is going to be with a wide mix of technologies, whether they are really high-tech, with longer roadmap and big impacts, but also with companies that can have an immediate impact within 2 years, but still with the ambition to make up to 150 million within these 2 years.
Yeah. Before we wrap up, I want to get some closing comments from all of you on AI. But before we do that, can we get the poll back up again, just so people can see the final results as we conclude this panel? Let's see, green hydrogen, which we haven't talked about.
Can people change now from solar to nuclear fusion?
I think the poll is closed.
This is closed.
Right, but it shows the scale of the job you have to do to persuade people. Samir, can I very quickly, AI, there's going to be a lot of talk about that here today, in terms of your work in clean tech. What sort of action points, what sort of use cases do you see for the technology?
Yeah. Of course, we can use it for optimizing the use of the reservoir, but I think what's much more interesting is the use of it in balancing the electricity grid, because in the future you will have much more electricity from wind and solar, and we see how important it is to balance the electricity grid. And in geothermal, we use quite a lot of electricity as well. It's the most efficient way of converting electricity into heat, but we still use quite a lot of electricity. And I think that we can use that AI to help with better balancing the electricity grid, and thereby, shutting off our heat pumps at the time where electricity is very expensive. And at that time, then the district heating system would normally use another heat source, but you can really use the geothermal and AI to help with balancing the electricity grid in a future where we will have much more wind and solar.
Thank you. Raphael, quick closing comment from you on AI?
Definitely, especially in the mining industry, where we have seen a lot of progress using AI. But I would say last year we were talking a lot about Web3. This year it's all about AI. Definitely, those two technologies are just the new tools that some clean tech can use to optimize better their application.
Art?
So I'm an old semiconductor guy, turned energy guy, and in semiconductors I did a lot of device physics work there, and in device physics, the guys that can do the best simulation always win. That's just, if you look at history, the companies that won did the best simulation. We now are able to do so much more simulation by not having to do it as humans, but actually using AI. And it's not just AI by itself, right? It's not as if, we asked the computer, can you please come up with this guy, right? That's not the case. So I think AI is incredibly important to increase the ability to do simulation in a much bigger way than we've ever done before. So
the simulations will save us.
Simulations will save us.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Jim Hageman-Snape, chairman of Siemens and Northvolt, with Bloomberg's Akshat Ratti.
Welcome to this live recording of the Zero podcast. We are a weekly podcast that talks about tactics and technologies that take us to zero emissions. I'm Akshat Ratti, a senior reporter for Bloomberg Green, and I am joined by Jim Snaber, who has been called Europe's top industrialist. So Jim, you're a chairman of Siemens and Northvolt. We'll start with Siemens. It's a German technology company. Until recently, you had Siemens Energy as part of it, which does wind turbines and gas turbines, but it's a separate company. So we're going to focus more on the core Siemens, that is. But before we come to that company, maybe we start with your childhood, because some of what you do today is informed by your time in Greenland. Tell me more about it.
Well, that is correct. When I was 2 years old, my parents decided to move the family to Greenland, of all places. My father was a helicopter pilot, and we lived there for 7 years. So as a child, it was a wonderful environment, a big playground full of snow. I remember Greenland as this cold place with an incredible amount of snow and not green at all. I think it's the first example of greenwashing, actually, in history. And of course, that does influence your view on things. I've always had a love for that country because it's one of the most beautiful countries. If you've never been, you should go. But it's also one of the places where you can actually get a feel for climate change, not in theory, not in numbers, but in reality.
And you visited Greenland 30 years after you first lived there, and then 20 years after that. That's 2002 and 2022, roughly. What were the changes that you saw, and how does that affect you as a business person leading major companies in the world?
Well, it does have a big effect because it's a place where you've grown, a love for, and you see the change. It influences you, no doubt. I was back in Greenland last time in April last year, and I was uniquely invited to this expedition to northeast Greenland, where there is nothing but nature, and it was in April, so it's pretty tough nature, and I was there with a small group of people who know how to survive in environments like that with a tent and 13 dogs. And so it's really survival. And you get very close to nature. First of all, you realize how nature doesn't need you. You need nature to survive. And secondly, normally in April, you will have minus 20 degrees in average during the day. And we had 2 days where the temperature was plus. Now, you can almost hear the ice melting. And it got to me, and I went back to study. I knew that, sea levels would rise if the inland ice would melt, but once you study that, it gets pretty scary. The ocean levels would rise 6 to 7 meters. So I think we're in an unsafe place here. And it gives you that urgency in the way you think about your leadership. And I have decided to now dedicate my leadership to accelerating the decarbonization of the world because, first of all, we must, otherwise we'll have a disaster. But I actually begin to believe that it is becoming maybe the biggest business opportunity ever, and certainly in my lifetime. So there's good reasons, 2 very good reasons, to pursue this opportunity.
And earlier this year, we met in Davos, and you told me that from a Siemens perspective, the energy transition is going well, that your role as a technology provider is going well. Do you still hold that view 10 months on? And where are the opportunities?
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, technology has always been, in my mind, the solution to issues. It is when we innovate for a different pattern that we create new opportunities and we create new, let's say, ways of looking at the world. Siemens today is not the Siemens that many know from the household appliances. It is an industrial Siemens. We basically do the infrastructures around cities, around manufacturing, and around transportation. And so you could argue we are in all of the infrastructures that consume energy. And we begin to see that the portion of our portfolio that helps companies get to zero carbon, that reduces their footprint and saves them money because they use less energy, is by far the fastest growing portion of our portfolio. We recently won a huge train system in Egypt, where we are delivering almost 200 trains, 54 fast-speed trains, there's cargo trains, there's regional trains. We're building 2,000 kilometers of rail, 60 stations. We will create employment of 40,000 people in the country. But most importantly, when this transportation system is up and running, not only will Egypt have the most modern transportation system in the world, potentially, but they also will save 70% of the CO2 emissions coming from transportation of people and goods. And so it's a good business case, it's a great business opportunity for Siemens, but it's also a path to a decarbonized future. And I think when we marry the two, we get out of this dilemma that, if we think of it as a cost, it's kind of too expensive and we don't want to do it too much. We need to do it enough. When it becomes a business opportunity, you want to do as much of it as possible because it's the way you make your money, and hence the transition happens at scale, the scale we need.
Now, when we talk about opportunities for Siemens to provide solutions to companies, it's also an opportunity for Siemens to look at itself and make sure its impact on the world is as small as possible. Now, Siemens has a target to reach net zero by 2050. We'll talk a little bit about accounting because we can't do that without talking about business. And we're going to talk about carbon accounting. So there are 3 types of emissions. There's scope 1, 2, and 3. Those are emissions that either you're burning natural gas in your buildings, scope 1, either you're getting natural gas power from somewhere else, scope 2. Those are typically less than, in your case, 10% of your total emissions. Scope 3, which is where what services you provide to your customers, the products you provide to your customers, that contribute 90% of your emissions. And they actually went up last year by 2.5%. Why is that happening when you have a clear plan to get to net zero?
Well, first of all, I think this is a very, very important discussion to have. I still remember a shareholder meeting in 2020. It was in February, just before COVID, so we actually had 6,000 people in the Olympiahalle in Munich, and we were excited to go there. We had great business results, and we also were proud that we had reached a milestone in our CO2 emissions. Siemens was one of the first industrial companies to commit to net zero. We did that in 2015, and we said we'll be net zero by 30, but that was scope 1 and 2. And in 2020, we had reached 52% reduction. So we were I was super proud to be in front of our shareholders and talk about 52%. And yet at that meeting, we had 120 climate activists scolding us for having sold some software that controls a train that we didn't build, but the train was actually used to transport coal from a mine in Australia. And for me, that was the wake-up call that scope 1 and 2 is just not enough. So with scope 3, you take responsibility for how your products are being used and what they're being used for, which of course is much more complicated. And if you grow your company, your emissions in scope 3 could easily go up. Now, what we calculated is the following interesting math. When we deliver an electric train or a hydrogen train like the deal in Egypt, one train in its lifetime, which is zero carbon train, will actually reduce CO2 emissions more than the annual combined CO2 emissions of Siemens. So the more trains we produce of that kind, the better the world becomes. And therefore, we are now shifting our focus to Scope 3 and trying to take responsibility for what our products do, because there's a much bigger business opportunity when you think of the problem that way than if you just think about your own emissions.
And one way you could do that is to not work with industries that are high polluting, but it's the exact opposite. On the Siemens website, you advertise that you would like to work with oil and gas companies, with cement companies, with mining companies. Why is that?
Yeah, so I'm not aware of that sentence on the website, but if you look at our portfolio today, we estimate that 90% of our portfolio is being used to reduce carbon emissions. So we don't have a preference to work with any of those industries. In fact, we are even selling off businesses that are too deeply involved with oil and gas. So it's simply not the case. Now, here's the dilemma. If we just scold the companies that emit a lot and don't try and help them reduce their emissions, we'll get nowhere. It doesn't help that we just let someone else do it. We do need to engage with those companies and reduce their emissions as well. And you can't go from 100 to 0 in 1 second. You have to have a responsible path to that future. Now, I do believe we're at the tipping point where we will stop burning fossil fuels to get energy.
Well, the most recent International Energy Agency report, the World Energy Outlook, just came out today, and they agree. They say all fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas, will peak this decade. And that after that, they see what they call a structural decline, which is that it's not just a cyclical economy has gone down the drain, that's why we are going to consume less fossil fuels, but there'll be a decline coming through. Now, one place where you are helping that decline happen is the other hat you wear with Northvolt, which is a battery company that is trying to build batteries for the auto industry here in Europe, which is a big employer. How does Siemens work with Northvolt to try and make that happen? Because that's a size of emissions reduction that can have a massive impact.
Yes, I think this is a very, very important problem to solve, because as you increase the share of renewable energy in an energy system, you get fluctuations in the energy system because you produce energy when there's sun and wind, and therefore you need intelligent infrastructure to transport energy, but most importantly, you need scalable, affordable storage opportunities, and so batteries will play a role. The first revolution is in the automotive industry with the electric vehicles, and the issue is that while an electric vehicle is carbon neutral, if you don't make the battery carbon neutral, then it doesn't help much. So Northvolt was created with this vision, this dream, to do it right. Let's start a completely new green battery company that not only produces the batteries with green electricity, because there's a lot of energy going into building a battery, but takes the batteries back once they're done in a vehicle, crushes them to, we call it black powder, and then extracts the lithium, the copper, the nickel of that battery, and use that to build the next battery. We are at a stage now with our technology at Northvolt where we can reuse up to 97% of the raw materials in a battery, which means we can get away from this idea that we need to dig out the raw materials in the soil and then use the battery for 7, 8, or 10 years and then throw it all out and create a very big disaster in terms of waste. We actually just take them back. And it's a great illustration of the difference between the fossil world and the renewable world, in that in the fossil world, when we burn the fossil fuel, it pollutes the air and disappears. In a green battery like this, with this approach, the atoms stay at our disposal. We can use them to build a battery, take them back and build the next battery and the next battery. There's no deterioration of atoms. It's the same atoms. In fact, according to our calculations, when we get to scale, the raw materials that we get from a used battery will be cheaper than the one we mine in a mine. And then, as you can see, this becomes not only good for the environment, it becomes a great business case.
Now, the challenge for Northvolt and the solution you've just outlined is a necessary one, not just from an environmental perspective, which is important. If you're going to build green technologies, you make sure they themselves are green. Of course, the avoided emissions are far greater, even if you don't build them green. But the challenge is really for regions like Europe, but also North America, is to have their own manufacturing of batteries in the first place. Now, China has overtaken the world combined on batteries, and not just in manufacturing them, but also controlling the very materials, the processed metals that go into batteries. And so if you get recycled material, you can keep it on shore and use them. But you will still have to start somewhere where you're going to need virgin materials. So what is it that Northvolt is doing now to try and manage what is a real severe supply domination by China in an era where geopolitics is causing more rupture to happen between Europe and China and America and China?
Yeah, we've seen what happened with the solar panel industry when China went in there and basically dumped the prices, which made manufacturing elsewhere irrelevant, and therefore China today is by far the biggest leader in this. Maybe there's a comeback in the horizon, I don't know, because of the generations of technology, but let's see. We should not let that happen to the battery. The battery will be a very important ingredient in the energy system as well as in the transportation system. So we must have the capacity in Europe, in North America to do that. What we are basically doing at Northvolt is we are sourcing the raw materials. Of course, in the ramp-up phase, you do need more. But we ask our technology to recycle the batteries is not dependent on the Northvolt battery itself. As long as it's a lithium-ion battery, we can take the batteries back, crush them to powder, and extract the atoms and build the next battery. And we expect that already by 2030, and don't forget this company is only 6 years old, by 2030, half of our raw materials will come from our own recycled batteries. And I think this actually, with the increased geopolitical tensions, it's going to be strategically important for each region to be self-sufficient with the critical raw materials that are necessary to create a sustainable infrastructure of the future.
And one way where we are seeing at least a movement from governments to try and overcome what is a China challenge on batteries is the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. There's the European Green Deal, very different kinds of policies that are being set out to enable manufacturing of these green technologies to happen onshore. Inflation Reduction Act is very much driven at giving you lots and lots of subsidies to try and make that happen. Europe, not quite so much. So how are you seeing as a European company that now has announced a Canada plant and has global ambitions playing out with the policy changes across the Atlantic?
So I actually see the IRA as a positive. And it might sound strange for a European leader to think that way. For me, it's not necessarily a barrier. It's an opportunity. The IRA is not limited to American companies. Any company can apply. And it's actually an accelerator of the transition to green technologies. And I welcome any accelerator we can have. Coming back to my experience on Greenland, we need exponential curves here. We cannot do linear, and maybe we'll do a little bit tomorrow. We need exponential curves. We need to be courageous in our leadership to dream big about what we could do and then get on with it. And the IRA is a catalyst for that. Europe should do something similar. It's in fact trying. It's a little bit more complicated, but we have the first factory in northern Sweden that was without those subsidiaries. We're now having committed a plant in Canada with IRA similar conditions. And we will also be looking for an opportunity in Europe, and with that create the necessary capacities for green batteries in Europe and in the US. So why is this important? I often say that in a joke, the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stone. And when you have new technologies that are better and more sustainable and maybe even cheaper eventually, you just need the incentives to be put in place to accelerate that future, or disincentives. If I was a policymaker, I would also put a price on CO2. And with that, innovation goes in avoiding it, rather than today where we kind of accept it and hope to limited in good faith. Yeah?
Now, just the last question, sort of going back to the start where you were called Europe's top industrialist. There's another reason. You were the chairman of Maersk until 2022, giant shipping company, which under your chairmanship was able to create a clear roadmap for what is an industry that has done very little on reducing emissions. Now you can sit outside and look at progress, and what have you achieved when you set those goals out, and how are they playing out now?
I think that story of zero carbon shipping is a great example of the courageous leadership that I believe business leaders need to have. I still remember the board meeting in 2018 when management said, why don't we commit to zero carbon shipping? And Maersk alone, which is 20% of shipping, consumes 10 million tons of bunker oil. It's still the least polluting way of transporting goods, but it's a lot of CO2. And the board would say, so how are we going to do that? And management said, we don't know. And then the board would say, what's the business case? And then management would say, we don't know. We don't even know the technology. And yet, in 2018, the company committed to zero carbon shipping by 2050. Now, 2050 is a long way out in the future, but to do that, you needed the first vessel sailing in 2030. And it felt very, very challenging. That first vessel sails now, 7 years ahead of that originally impossible plan. We have ordered more than 28 vessels now in total. And interestingly enough, in 2018, nobody thought zero carbon shipping would be possible. In 23, we now have the first vessel sailing. And the industry have now ordered 128 methanol vessels. Methanol is a green fuel. It's produced by green electricity. You basically take it through electrolyzer, you get hydrogen, and you add CO2 to hydrogen, you get methanol, or you add nitrogen to hydrogen, and you get ammonia. And these are fuels that will have zero carbon impacts on this world. Vessels with a new engine can sail on that. And with this path, we can solve zero carbon shipping. And my conclusion as a leader, if you can do zero carbon shipping, if you can do zero carbon in shipping, you can do zero carbon in any industry. So it's just for us to have the courage to lead that way.
So in these three companies that you've led, have you seen when you take this step, which is bold, ambitious, risky, but then eventually pays off and people see it pay off, being copied by others? Are you seeing that leadership spread out?
It's beginning, and it's interesting to see that it's almost like for 200 years, industrialization has taught us to specialize. But you can't redo an entire value chain for zero carbon shipping if everyone is doing their piece. It's almost like asking a symphony orchestra to play a new tune where the trumpets start with their new tune and the others play the old tune at the same time. That doesn't sound very well. I think that's the time we're in the world right now. It doesn't sound that well. So you need someone to orchestrate the reinvention. Maersk orchestrated the reinvention for shipping, and it's working. Siemens is trying to do it in manufacturing, in urban areas, and in transportation. Northvolt is doing it in the battery space. And they're taking an end-to-end view of the industry and inviting everyone to play. I think that's the approach we need. And when that happens, you de-risk the project, and you get exponential scale.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.
Two things to say at the end. First, you can listen to Zero wherever you get your podcasts. You'll get to hear more of these conversations every Thursday. And there is a coffee break, and you're required to come back at 10:30 when the proceedings start again. Thank you.
The streets feel up. We're mixed with light. Ghost town blown down. And life shines back. Going fast, such a blast on a train, on a boat, on a plane. So good to feel the rush again. And it's never coming down. We're invincible. You and my kid, we take a spin down the highway, never let go. So we drive to the show and we shout, we don't know how it goes. So good to feel the rush again. And it's never coming down, we're invincible.
Earth's ecosystems are delicately balanced, but they're under threat from our actions. And so monitoring biodiversity will allow business leaders to opt for more sustainable practices. With so many data points, though, traditionally that's been easier said than done.
So Naturemetrics is a global nature technology company. We make biodiversity measurable by analysing the tiny traces of DNA that all organisms leave behind in the environment. The process works by literally just taking water in a syringe and pushing it through a filter like this. And it captures all of the DNA from the water, so the water comes out the other side, and all of the DNA from the water gets stuck inside, and then this is sent to our labs for analysis. So it's something that, literally anybody anywhere in the world can do. Yes, I got some strange looks when I went to investors and said, I'm going to revolutionize the scale of biodiversity monitoring. And they went, what? Who's going to pay for that? I mean, biodiversity is not important enough for anyone with money. But actually that was wrong, because there was a market already, particularly in companies that were doing environmental impact assessments. Don't let perfect be the enemy of the good, especially if you're a scientist. You can often feel like it's got to be ready to publish or ready to write a PhD paper on, or you've tested it 15 times before you go out and start using it. And you have to take such a different approach in business.
Please welcome to the stage Jared Kaplan, co-founder and chief science officer at Anthropic, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Brad Stone.
All right, welcome back, and Jared, welcome.
Thank you.
I feel so fortunate to have you here at the Tech Summit. I mean, Anthropic is one of the companies that's really defining this new wave of generative AI that's sparking this flood of talent and capital into generative AI companies, along with OpenAI, of course, and Google's Bard and Bing. But I know that Anthropic makes an argument that your language model and chatbot Claude is different than the others, is differentiated. So give us the argument. Why is Anthropic a different kind of generative AI company?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. So there are a few things that make Claude different from other chatbots that are available now. One of them is that it's trained with a technique called constitutional AI that allows us or the public to provide a short list of principles that the AI is supposed to abide by, called a constitution. And then the AI system is able to train itself to try to follow those principles. Another interesting feature about Claude is that it has a very, very, very long context length. What that means is that Claude can read many, many scientific papers, even something as long as a short book, and talk to you about it, answer questions about it. And that really makes it possible to kind of engage with AI in a new way.
Okay, I want to start out by posing a poll question to the audience, and we'll see the results, but perhaps we can keep the poll open, and maybe you could even make your argument and sway them a little bit. So the poll question is, would you be more or less likely to use an AI assistant that has been trained with and maybe constrained by a set of strict moral values? So the kind of constitutional AI that Jared's talking about, more likely AI should be ethical, less likely you don't need an AI nanny, give me something unconstrained, or C, it won't impact my choices. I mean, Jared, why, so you've defined constitutional AI, why should people care, right? I mean, if any, you don't want Google with guardrails. You want to search the web. So why would you want AI that's constrained?
It's a great question. And of course, any individual person, if they're playing with an AI, they know they're a moral person. They're going to do the right thing. So why should they care? I think the reason, there are a couple of reasons. I think the main reason why we're interested in this is that we think that AI has risks and problems when used at scale already. It's not that it's just one person playing with an AI by themselves. It's millions of people and companies deploying these systems at scale. And so we're very concerned about issues like bias and misinformation, problematic content. We're also concerned about people misusing AI to, say, generate misinformation ahead of elections. So that's the kind of thing we're very concerned about. The other thing that's on our minds is that we think AI is going to get much, much more capable very soon. We think that systems that we have now, like Claude, will be replaced with systems in just the next few years that are much smarter, able to do much more complex tasks. And so as AI systems effectively become more powerful, the risks become more serious. And so it's very important to us to get ahead of that and do the research today to make systems more interpretable, more reliable, and safer, so that we're prepared for even more powerful AI systems tomorrow.
And now those concerns about reliability and safety, they're shared by your colleagues in the industry, and in particular, your former colleagues at OpenAI. And I just want to revisit the founding story of Anthropic, because it's so curious to me. I mean, you're a theoretical physicist. You're a professor at Johns Hopkins. You were a consultant at OpenAI. When you and a bunch of your colleagues, Dario, the CEO, Daniela, an executive, and his sister, my former colleague, Jack Clark, broke off to start Anthropic. So, to the extent that you want to flash back a little bit, tell us in 2021 what you saw at OpenAI that made you guys think that to really pursue these values, you had to do it outside OpenAI with your own company.
Yeah, so for a very long time, so I've actually been friends with Dario and Daniela and Chris Ola, some of the other founders, for more than a decade. And they've been talking to me about AI for quite a while, telling me that it was going to be absolutely transformative. And of course, I thought that they were crazy. But over time, I sort of read more and more about the AI literature. I spent time with some other people, so I come from physics, other physicists, reading and learning about the subject. And I was really struck by the pace of change. And this is something that Dario had been thinking about for a long time. He wrote this paper back in 2016, before any of the AI systems people are excited about today even existed, before the technology for them existed, arguing that we could already start working on kind of concrete problems to make these systems safer in case they did, in fact, become really powerful and transformative for society. And so I think for a long time, many of us had kind of a vision of building an organization that put this kind of safety research at the center of what we did, and we just wanted to be able to pursue that vision on our own.
And was there a feeling that your former colleagues at OpenAI didn't have the same values or were moving too fast?
No, I mean, I still keep in touch with those people. I mean, I think I had dinner with people from OpenAI just a few months ago. I mean, we're all still friends. We still talk. But we just thought, I mean, maybe it's a sort of Silicon Valley sense, but like, if you have an idea, you start a company.
Right. And yet there really is a sort of foot race in AI happening now before us all in terms of raising money, partnerships. Anthropic, of course, recently announced a partnership with Amazon, has raised money from Google. There's a war for talent going on. There's a feature race with the latest products. And I guess I wonder, does the old-fashioned Silicon Valley requirements of speed and competitiveness, is there tension with the more cautious constitutional AI approach?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And something that we'd really like to see, and that's sort of part of the reason why we're excited to have started Anthropic, is we think that there should be kind of a race to the top on safer AI, more ethical AI in preparation for the fact that we believe there will be more powerful systems on the horizon. So I think the goal is for there to be competition in the direction of safer and more reliable systems. So to sort of make that concrete, we recently made a set of commitments, a responsible scaling policy, responsible scaling commitments about basically standards that we'll hold ourselves to as we build more powerful systems. So the current systems that we have now, like Claude 2, we have information security, we have constitutional AI. We think that that's sufficient, but we're imagining systems that are effectively able to operate autonomously, a system that might be able to sort of install itself and run itself on new computers all on its own, or a system potentially that might be used by bad actors to, say, build or operate cyber weapons, other kinds of weapons. We all know that current AI systems are really helpful to software engineers for coding, but if you take that a step further, the more powerful equivalent systems could be used for hacking. So we're very concerned about those possibilities and even more speculative possibilities over the next few years. And so we made a set of commitments about the sort of information security and the level of safety and robustness to what's called red teaming, where people try to break these models to get them to violate their principles and do something bad. So we made a set of commitments for evaluation and testing, and then effectively we can't release these systems if we can't meet certain safety benchmarks. And so our hope is that kind of thinking, maybe something very similar, maybe something else equivalent, will be embraced by other competitors, and that we'll all be sort of racing to develop technology that's more reliable and more steerable, controllable, et cetera.
Yeah, and tell us about Claude 2 and who's using it, and is the proposition of constitutional AI and accountability and perhaps a little bit more transparency, is it having an impact in the marketplace?
Absolutely, yeah. So I mean, I think there's sort of a very simple bottom line sense in which no large company, no enterprise wants to use an AI system that might insult their customers or give incorrect information to their associates, their customers, et cetera. So I think that the sort of safety brand and trustworthiness really is something that a lot of companies are excited to work with Claude because of that reliability.
And how about with consumers? I mean, maybe it's early, but of course we see OpenAI integrating with Bing. We see Google making Bard an increasingly prominent part of every search. Where in this emerging environment does Claude factor in?
Yeah, I mean, so you can go to Claude.ai and talk to Claude 2 just for free. You can also sign up for a Claude Pro account and then get a lot more usage. You can give Claude lots of material. You can take advantage of its long context to talk to books, things like that. So we're definitely seeing a lot of engagement from consumers as well.
Okay. Of course, there is a big, raging, and somewhat endless debate in the AI world about AGI and this idea of AI that achieves a semblance of human cognition, and of course, lots of debate over when, if, how, why, what happens. What is your personal view of how far away we are from that point?
It's a great question. I don't know that we're actually that far away. I mean, as you mentioned, I was working as a physicist before. I moved to AI, and I started working on AI because I just thought that the promise of the technology was incredible. And so I definitely expect that level of AI system in my lifetime, and I think it's quite plausible in the next 5 to 10 years. So I think it could be quite imminent. Now, I mean, we might be wrong. I was always very skeptical of these statements maybe 10 years ago, but I've slowly become convinced. So why is that? Well, if you play with Claude or ChatGPT, you're sort of seeing a snapshot in time of what AI was capable of. What you haven't done is played with GPT, I imagine, is played with GPT-1, which could barely write a coherent sentence, or GPT-2, which couldn't really write a coherent paragraph. Or maybe you've played with GPT-3, which was sort of one of the first models that was made commercial by OpenAI, which can write a few paragraphs, but it's really hard to control. It's really hard to get what you want out of that model. It certainly couldn't do math. It couldn't really write all that much computer code, et cetera. And so if you see the rate of progress viscerally, firsthand over just the last 5 years, that's all it took to get from GPT-1 to current models, it's not so crazy to imagine that the next set of models, Claude 3, Claude 4, GPT-5, et cetera, are going to be capable of even more incredible things that maybe people aren't anticipating right now.
Okay, so you're talking about really exponential growth. Do you foresee any bottlenecks, either the availability or the expense of compute, or even just the availability of data that there might be to crawl? I mean, right now, obviously, everybody with copyright owners are starting to put restrictions on the way in which their material can be crawled. So when you develop Claude 3, are there bottlenecks?
It's a great question. I think it's possible there are bottlenecks, but there are a lot of people who said that large language models weren't really capable of much just a few years ago, and that AI was going to run into a wall. And I think the meme is more that AI is just bashing through every wall that we see. So I think there could be bottlenecks with data. There could be bottlenecks with compute. But my guess is that innovation is going to find a way to keep improving AI systems.
And do you need more content to crawl to develop the next version of Claude, or is there a point at which it can kind of train itself and learn to reason and doesn't need to ingest as much data?
That's a great question. I think it's very plausible that at some point it won't need more data. If you look at constitutional AI, the thing that's cool about constitutional AI technically is that AI is training itself. You don't need people to label data to train a safe model. You can just have the AI model learn to abide by a set of principles by supervising itself. And so that's an example already where basically 100% of the data is synthetic that Claude's using to train itself. And so I can't imagine these kinds of patterns continuing, and so people getting around data bottlenecks in that way.
There is a big kind of raging debate, even among the sort of founding fathers of AI, about the threat to humanity. And on one side, you've got the great Canadian AI researcher, Yoshua Bengio, who is saying that there's kind of real danger here as these systems develop. And then you have Yann LeCun from Meta saying actually there's a quiet minority of AI scientists who believe that progress is going to do more good than harm, and that the threats are overstated. Lots of self-serving voices here. On the spectrum of alarmism, where is Jared Kaplan?
Yeah. So my expectation, I think my kind of default guess is that AI is going to be incredibly beneficial. It's going to make our lives easier. It's going to give us access to better medicine, better ideas. It's going to make productivity easier. That's my default assumption. But I think my view also, I think in a kind of a common sense way, is that if you have a technology that's becoming more and more powerful every year in really dramatic ways, that there's reason to be wary and reason to be sort of thoughtful about that progress. Because any technology that makes companies, governments, and individuals much more powerful, gives them access to a lot of new information, could also potentially be misused in harmful ways. And furthermore, I think none of the AI models we have now are perfect. So Claude is definitely not perfect. Constitutional AI is not perfect. It's possible to jailbreak Claude and get around its safety guardrails. That's true for Bard, for GPT, for basically every model out there. And so we already have these systems that are fairly powerful, but maybe just beginning to be useful, that we can't 100% control. I can't give you a 100% guarantee or anything like that these systems are controllable or safe. So if you imagine that we get much more powerful systems without learning anything new about how to make them safer, and I think it really begs the question of sort of where are we headed? Are these systems really going to be controllable when we have Claude 4, et cetera? And so I think that both for misuse reasons and because the actual technology to make these systems controllable and do what we want, for both of these reasons, I'm concerned, and I think regulators should be as well.
You know, it's interesting. I mean, on that question, one of the most surprising things of the last year has been AI researchers like Geoffrey Hinton stepping out of their day-to-day roles and really expressing some kind of existential doubt about their role in the industry, about the direction of the technology. Has that self-doubt infected you at all? Have you ever stopped to think, okay, what role am I playing, and you know, how much good am I doing here, considering the long-term questions?
Absolutely. So I mean, I got involved in AI mostly because I was becoming convinced that there was going to be this rapid rate of progress, and therefore there were benefits, but also risks, and I really wanted to work on maximizing the benefits, minimizing the risks. And at every step in the research that I've done, and as we've deployed the technology, I find it daunting how widely used and how this technology is already, basically at the rate of change, rate of progress, the way that it's not just a bunch of nerds at a lab somewhere who are excited, but the whole world has kind of woken up and is embracing this technology. So I find that daunting. I also I'm concerned about technology just because it's sort of dual use. So maybe to give the most surprising example, when we first developed constitutional AI and were writing a paper about it, I think in some ways that paper was almost one of the scariest that I've written, because I felt like, well, anyone can write this constitution, any AI developer. So although we're trying to develop this research to make AI safer and more ethical, someone else could turn it around and misuse it. And so I think really kind of drove home to me this idea that the technology is dual use, that it can be used for good or ill.
So next week, Dario, your CEO, is coming to London and is going to participate in Rishi Sunak's AI Summit. And in addition to a lot of other AI leaders from the US, I wonder what you think, you know, global leaders like the Prime Minister are trying to accomplish there. What can reasonably be accomplished?
Well, yeah. So I think probably a lot can be accomplished. I think the danger is that the technology is moving so quickly that it's very difficult to know exactly what kind of actions governments can take to improve AI. And of course, I think we're going to a large extent to listen and to help in whatever way we can. But I think there are a few things. So for one thing, you might imagine that it's easy to determine, is an AI system beneficial, is it safe? And we don't think it's easy at all. We think that evaluating these systems, because they're so general purpose, is really, really challenging. And so we think that investing in that is really important. And then we also think that something perhaps inspired by, vaguely similar to our responsible scaling policy, where we avoid crying wolf and saying that every single AI system needs to be regulated, every single AI system is dangerous, but we really take a sort of forward-looking approach and say, look, at a certain point, these AI systems could become so powerful that they are really dangerous and really do merit regulation, and trying to find a way to do that in a way that's sort of sensitive to the way the technology will change over time, I think is really important, and I hope Anthropic can help contribute to that mission.
And what does it mean practically? Do you give access to governments like the UK government, access to the foundational model? Do you allow governments to test Claude?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it could mean many things. I think, first of all, governments, of course, are funders of academic research. A lot of that research does focus on safety and continue to, and in particular on evaluations for these systems. And then if, as the sort of science of evaluation advances, then it should be possible to also create some sort of well-informed regulations on systems that are sufficiently powerful or sufficiently problematic.
We've got 2 minutes left. I want to hit 2 more points. You recently engaged in an experiment called collective constitutional AI, essentially allowing your users to suggest the rules. And I'm curious practically where that experiment starts and stops, particularly considering you might get 2 wildly different sets of rules in different parts of the US and different regions of the world.
Yeah, so that's a great question that you raised. So what we did is we used this platform, Polis, to basically sort of source potential constitutional principles. Then we allowed people participating, there were around 1,000 people, to basically accept or reject or modify these principles and vote on kind of what principles seemed best. The list of principles we got, and this was in the US, was actually quite similar to the kind of constitution that we created initially as kind of a rough draft for Claude. Differed in a few ways. I think there was sort of more of an insistence that the model kind of at every stage acknowledge that it was an AI, that it not be confused with a person. But to the broader question, yeah, I mean, this is a procedure you could try to follow around the world in order to sort of source information about global values.
Yeah. Okay, leave us with this. As we look back at Claude 2 in 10 years, or GPT-4, what are we going to make of these models that we're now using in 2023?
I think that in 10 years, Claude 2 will look extraordinarily limited and primitive, and very, very confined in the sense that with, say, Claude 2, all you can do is talk to it. It can't use any other modalities. I think that systems in 10 years will look much, much, much more powerful, and I hope they are also much safer and more beneficial.
All right, we'll leave it there. Jared Kaplan, thank you very much.
Please welcome to the stage Ben Bloom, partner at Atomico, and Rebecca Tristan, head of operations at Pigment, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Aggie Cantrill.
Hello. So, 2023 is the year that investors and startups have really begun to tout the advancements in artificial intelligence and where this technology is breaking new ground. A lot of that hype has been focused around Silicon Valley, but we're here today to talk about what it could potentially mean for Europe and what sort of startups there are in Europe that are breaking ground themselves in this space. So firstly, we have Ben Bloom from Atomico. He's a partner in the investment team at Atomico, and he leads investments in enterprise software, SaaS companies. Before Atomico, Ben spent time as a software engineer at Bank of America Merrill Lynch and a consultant at Bain & Company. He's been working on investments in automation, digital work, and enterprise data. And we also have Rebecca Tristan, who is the head of operations at Pigment, a business planning platform that boasts clients like Deliveroo, Klarna, and Figma. Pigment leverages data and AI to provide enterprises with decision-making software. Rebecca oversees the operations at Pigment as well as the people and customer teams. And before working at Pigment, she worked at Meta and at LinkedIn. So good to have you both here today. What we're focusing on today is the role that Europe is going to be playing in investment in AI and also how AI will develop on the continent and also in the UK going forward. And so we're starting today with a poll that we'll discuss at the end, but we'd love for all of you to give your own opinion on this. We want to talk about where can Europe be a leader in AI. And of course, we know about the European AI Act, and we know that AI regulation is going to be a core part of Europe's focus on AI, but also potentially you may think that developing ways to apply AI, such as Pigment, is the way that Europe can excel, or should we be building our own models? Should we be trying to compete with the likes of OpenAI or Bard? So, let's start there. Microsoft's giant investment in OpenAI, Google's launch of Bard, and Meta's Llama 2. We've seen a huge amount of big tech players invest a huge amount of money in this technology in the last several months. And so why don't we start there? Where does Europe ensure it will be a creator of this technology as opposed to just a user of big tech's technology?
Thanks. It's a great and important question, and I think probably sets the tone for a lot of the kind of nuances we can take the discussion in. But I think first thing to say is if you continue the list onwards from the names you started with, there's also some amazing European companies already in that list, Mistral and Aleph Alpha and others. So There's lots of money going into European origin, foundation model, large language model companies, as well as the kind of big tech companies, which is great to see. I think what's also important is to think about what really is important, what really matters to be built from Europe, and what we actually are really talking about. And I think what's very exciting to see is that even if the kind of forefront and the most funding for those kind of foundation and kind of fundamental model companies is with the big tech players, I think the amount of innovation of kind of at the application level of people using this technology to solve real world problems and build real commercially valuable applications is already kind of well ahead in Europe as well.
And maybe just to add to that, I mean, maybe unpopular opinion, and I know it's part of the poll, but this is my personal opinion, but I don't believe that there's a lot of value in focusing on building a model from scratch. And I know we are doing that. There's a lot of investment going into that. But if we can leverage that to build really strong applications and be ahead of the curve, I think this is where Europe will thrive and where I would focus on my efforts, because we don't have the luxury of all of the years and years of data and money that these companies in big tech have. So maybe in line of that with regulation, and I know this is a big topic we're going to talk about today, but if we are able to protect a way that not only big tech benefits from the use of AI, this is where Europe being the first continent to regulate, we're going to be much more ahead of the curve in that regard.
And we've been hearing this saying over and over again in the tech scene in the last year, that in a few years saying we use AI will be like saying now we have an app. And both from the perspective of Pigment as a company that is applying AI right now, and as an investor with Atomico, how do you make sure that you're able to still stay ahead of something that is going to become so ubiquitous that investing in it now or developing it now may just be par for the course in a couple of years?
Yep.
Go for it.
I mean, I'm happy to start, but I think there's it's kind of, to your point, as building an app, this is just going to become something that every company is doing. Right now, it's a little bit of a buzzword, and there's a lot of ways in which companies are doing AI, and a lot of it, it's in a way quite fake. And so we have to be, first of all, when we're thinking about building AI, is making sure that there's a useful use of the application and there's trust. And I think this is the biggest thing that we can invest in right now for our teams and companies, and it's how we're building it at Pigment. But if we don't have trust, of course, people are not going to use it. How do we create that trust? First is, of course, with the people, the talent behind that is building it. They not only have to be skilled at using AI and learning that quickly, but also building it the right way. So responsibly being conscious about how we are going to be using this technology, but then also in terms of the data systems behind it. So for example, in Pigment, we're quite lucky because we are using only our customers' data for their own use. So there's no external kind of inaccurate data, if you will, because they're using their own data, their own models that they've cleaned up and leveraged. But if we think about maybe like opening that up and where it could be an issue, and I was telling Aggie this story, but this week alone, a University of Chicago released an AI poison called Nightshade. I don't know if you've heard about it already, but basically it's to protect the artist's copyright. So they're embedding this into their work, and what it does is that it tricks learning models to basically, pollute the data, and it could have crazy negative effects in the accuracy of data. And so this is where, if we're not careful, if we don't build the right systems of data checks and infrastructure, as much as you can say you have AI, if you don't have an investment in the foundational work, you're not going to build something useful. So this is where I think, again, Pigment is quite luxury in the sense that we have the data of our customers, and that's what we're doing. But if we're thinking more opening up to the world, you have to be very careful.
Yeah, and I think, from an investor perspective, I think it's about really looking at places where you can apply this kind of pretty transformational and extremely powerful technology, either where you've got access to a lot of proprietary data that you can do something really differentiated with, or where you take it into a domain where that domain is otherwise technical and complex, and where it's not as easy to get started. So if I kind of give an anecdote, when these technologies were really kind of coming to the first wave of the forefront earlier this year, we spent the first few months looking at, what would it look like to have PowerPoint with AI in it, or what would it look like to have Notion with AI, or Miro with AI, or whatever else it was. And there was a whole wave of companies that cropped up in the first few months that were pitching that and raised lots of money. But what was extremely apparent very quickly was that those incumbent vendors, to call them that, were able to very quickly deploy this technology into their own products, because as well as being extremely powerful, it's actually relatively it's extremely easy to implement and get kind of effective performance from. And so, what we very quickly moved to is looking at, what does it look like if we take this into medical domains or into engineering and manufacturing domains or otherwise, where the domain is more complex, there's lots more kind of complex data and kind of internal data, but where the results can have similar impact, but actually therefore create a lot more commercial value.
Talking about the idea of should Europe develop its own large language models, maybe there's a way of us looking at that in a more focused way, as opposed to building a large language model that is a competitor to Bard or another big tech player. Is there a space in which specific industries, thinking about the health sector, as you just mentioned, the defense sector, are there specific industries where actually developing your own large language model is not only an investment case for it, but also a strategic case for it?
Yeah, and I think when we look at the kind of AI landscape, we look at the kind of general purpose foundation models for text, video, images, whatever else. And then you look at these kind of domain-specific or kind of functional foundation models, which are still kind of core models that you can build on top of, but that could achieve specific things. So, like MedPalm or something trained on only medical data, or something that could be trained on, let's say governmental data or policy data or something similar. I think they take less, they're less expensive to build because you can train on narrow data sets. You don't need to train these things on the entire internet, and therefore it's more achievable to build that without $10 billion of funding. And then also, if you look at that in a kind of national or European domain, you get the value of training that only on kind of local data and tuning that for what it makes sense to kind of look at in a kind of European or kind of country by country perspective. And so I think that's a great thing to do. I think, also if you look at then more strategic areas like defense, where, we might want proprietary models that are, closed or within one ecosystem, I think it's a sort of similar argument to make.
And Rebecca, when you're looking at the enterprise software that you're offering to companies, it seems like a lot of the companies that you work with are startups or growth stage companies that are already in themselves digital natives. What industries do you think it will be much harder to transform with AI, like the AI that you're providing? Because perhaps they're not digitized enough, or because it's just something that is so foreign to this industry?
Yeah, so I think I kind of think a lot about maybe defense, health. Those are the areas that will be quite difficult, I think, to provide something that's quite as open as this and leverage that. I also think in terms of difficult, I definitely think the creative space is something that is very difficult to automate and change at that level. So I would say that's kind of the high-level industries. In terms of our customer base, and I think as with any technology, digital transformation is difficult. And so the more the company is avoidant and not as comfortable with change management, innovating, they will struggle. I think the world is full of examples of companies that were at the top of their game, thinking like, I don't know, Kodak, and then just completely disappeared. And so I think that applies to any sort of digital transformation. But this is, if I think of our customer base, of course, their early adopters are kind of fast-moving companies that are embracing this change and are comfortable with that.
But I think that also goes in really nicely to your statement before, like, what will happen when AI is like having an app, right? I think in the end, the technology will kind of fade into the background, and what will become important is, can you deploy that technology in a way that it's extremely usable, that is extremely accessible to your target user group? And I think that solves the problem, right? When we stop or we move away from the point where everyone has made with AI on the front page of their website and all their marketing materials, and it's an assumed technology as part of the stack, and again, it becomes really more about results, about the impact it's going to have on your business. Then people. And I think the stigma around AI has really shifted over the last. I think 3 or 4 years ago, the questions on this panel would have been, is everybody really scared of AI? Are people still thinking about the Terminator? Now I think people understand and have seen in the last year, particularly, there is real impact and the fear is gone. But I agree. Slow-moving traditional companies are still. Everyone wants an AI strategy. That's coming down from the board, but it still feels a lot like there's kind of a lot of noise about people saying, we want to be seen to be doing something here, and then when it comes to actually signing contracts, people are a lot slower. But I think hopefully if you again produce really valuable products that people can really see the benefit from, then AI or not, I think that's going to be the kind of primary thing and ease adoption into any industry.
And with Atomico, what do you think is a challenge that you haven't really seen be secured? You haven't really seen an AI company that is really tackling something that you're looking for as an investor?
I mean, I think what's really exciting is that we're seeing AI applied to kind of all of the domains we look at. So whether it's, we just invested in a company bringing AI into kind of warehouses and logistics. We invested in a company building, that's called Dextery, a company called Corti, who is putting AI as a kind of clinical co-pilot. We have AI in a company called DeepL doing AI translation. Like, we're really seeing AI in such a wide range of industries. And, everywhere we look, every time we pick off a new problem, we're seeing companies, for example, new materials development. That's an area that's, a pretty frontier topic for us. And you see companies, amazing teams out of DeepMind and others who are taking that problem and charging forward with it. So I can't actually think of an area that we're not seeing this technology applied in. I think the technology is moving so fast, the kind of innovation is moving so fast, it's almost a bit of a race of what can you do with the newest technologies as they kind of improve. But that's an exciting thing to see, I think.
And we'd be remiss to talk about AI in Europe and not talk about the European AI Act and efforts to regulate it. Of course, this was actually something that the EU had been working towards before the current hype around the technology. And so I'm curious, do you think there's any benefit for Europe being first out of the gate in this form of regulation?
So on my view, there is, and I'll let Ben go after, but the fact that we are the first, it means that we're going to be building with these constraints in mind in a way. We're going to think about it from the beginning. We're going to be more responsible. And I think the key here, which is something that in a way we've maybe learned from GDPR, and we've learned in different ways that Europe has gone ahead on this, that it has to be a balance, and we're not going to get it perfect, and we're going to have to, everyone will be uncomfortable in some ways, but it has to be simple, so something that everyone can understand and apply. It has to allow enough time for companies to adapt whatever the regulations will be, and it also really needs to make sure that it doesn't exclude the little players out there, and this is where maybe the big tech can be quite a in a way, a fear of mine in a sense. I was thinking of like Spotify, where, they say that they couldn't be successful if they were made today because obviously Google and Apple control the distribution. And so if that's going to be the case of the big tech and we don't regulate it in a way and we just allow only the companies that have a lot of deep pockets and money to play, we're not going to achieve what we want. But if we do it in a way simple and constructively enough, we will definitely be ahead of the game from everyone else who will be trying to then adjust, which I think, having been at Meta as well, for example, is very difficult to kind of shuffle once you've gone down a very deep path. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think I see things totally the same way, right? It's you need to have clear, simple frameworks. You need to take into, you need to have consultation with all of the relevant stakeholders so that you hear those views as you kind of produce those frameworks, those policies, and then long term, it's of benefit if companies are born into a clear regulatory environment, they have a kind of a clean playing field to kind of build from, and then there's not a kind of hard point down the line where suddenly you've got to adjust to regulation coming kind of left, right, and center at you. In the short term, can it be an impediment if somebody else can move faster in a less regulated environment? Possibly. I think if you look at potentially some of the computer vision technology in China, where you might say with less regulation, the technology's gone a lot further, a lot faster. It's probably a case study of that. But I think overall, I think the benefits are clear, and I think Europe has, in the end, in things like GDPR, has been shown to produce good policy that has been adopted or kind of similarly adopted elsewhere. So there's a good path. I think we'll have to see how it goes when the kind of final versions of this stuff come out.
Criticism I've heard about the European AI Act is that by regulating it through the applications of the technology as opposed to through the way that the technology is developed, trying to make the act technologically agnostic. It's been characterized to me as it's sort of a game of whack-a-mole, where basically every single time there's a new technology, a new application, you have to reassess, you have to regulate each new application, which creates a huge burden on regulators, but also on people innovating who will maybe not be going into every new application blind. I'm curious what you guys think of that. Do you think that it's a good strategy to be regulating the applications as opposed to the underlying technology?
I think it's very hard. Well, it's hard to put regulation anywhere, as you say. If you try and regulate the end applications, it's a bit of a whack-a-mole. If you try and regulate the technology itself, it's quite hard to know where to draw those, how to even do that, right? And I think, as more and more of this technology comes from open source as well, it becomes even harder to, regulate open source communities, let alone big tech. I think looking at some of the, the most recent language in the kind of versions of this act, I think this idea of coming somewhere in between and regulating kind of classes of applications. So is it augmenting a human decision? And if so, that's less regulation because it's not making a decision on its own, or is it doing a kind of high risk versus low risk decision? And I think that if you can sensibly draw up kind of classes and categories, and then in anything that's broadly more safe, allow a little bit more kind of self-certification of that, I think that again starts to feel like the right direction. It's challenging, right? That's why this stuff is taking years to draw up. But I like that idea of trying to take common themes that are somewhere between the kind of fundamental technology and end applications and say, this is how the regulation applies to those kind of categories rather than, this is how it applies if you're trying to do credit application processing.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more on that. Maybe just one thing I'll add in terms of maybe the infrastructure and the technology behind, and we spoke about this also on the break, but around just copyright infringement, protecting the law of people when we're talking about getting all of this data from the open internet. So I think that would be more of what I would like us to see regulated, and then going more into this kind of application of is it health, is it defense, is it very high risk, or is it something, I don't know, like music choices? And so that's how I would think about it.
And just before we go to the poll, I wanted to ask you guys as well. We've heard AI be referred to as the latest hype cycle, and that has, of course, brought with it massive valuations. Of course, you've also raised money this year, among many other AI-focused companies. What do you think the risk is of characterizing AI as the latest hype cycle and see these huge valuations for some of these startups?
Mm-hmm. For me, as with anything, you have to have substance behind. And so I think that's one of the things when we first started thinking about Pigment AI, was that we didn't want it to be a buzzword. Like, we really thought long and hard about how could our customers benefit from it. There was a very, quick prototype, and we tested that with our customers really early on. They've actually been part of the beta. And so I think the key of this and not being just a hype is that there definitely has to be value behind it. And so I would just cautious, I guess, companies that are just building something to kind of, plaster and just put AI behind it. We were, of course, very fortunate that, through that we had our Series C investment, and AI was definitely a part of that story of when we were telling the narrative and our investors were looking to invest. They were very pleased to see, and I think very pleased to see the testimonial and outcome from our customers, which was I think, I'm sure what you guys are looking for. Yes. When you're making these decisions.
Yeah, and look, I think, in my view, calling it the kind of latest hype cycle really doesn't do it justice. I think, if I think about previous kind of hype cycles, we had obviously a crypto hype cycle. You look back at things like Internet of Things, AR, VR, and smart cities, these kind of things. At times, these were all kind of waves and hype cycles. I think, personally, I've always felt this is different. I think the technology is an order of magnitude more powerful. I think it's, time to value is quicker, value across multiple areas is much clearer. And so, there's a bunch of different views on this out there, but I think this is definitely more like, the internet and mobile than it is like crypto or VR in terms of, the order. And therefore, I think you see it as a step change technology rather than as a kind of, short-term hype bubble. That said, valuations probably do follow that kind of more kind of bubble characteristic, and there's lots of things about the dynamics of the venture industry that sort of drive that. So I wouldn't say that necessarily AI companies will maintain the valuation premiums that they currently have forever as that technology matures, but that's more a kind of fundamental of the venture industry than it is a kind of challenge with the technology itself.
Great. So I guess now we can pull up the results of the poll, see what you think. So yes, the EU has lived up to its stereotype, and in this audience, at least, people think that regulation is definitely where they can lead. It's also interesting. Applications, of course, is really the way that we're seeing a lot of this being applied, both through where investors are looking and with companies like Pigment. So that's really interesting. Thank you so much for this panel, Ben and Rebecca. This has been great. And thank you. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Beatrice Sansais, Partner, Global AI and Data Consulting Leader at EY.
So great to be here. Building confidence, creating exponential value, and unlocking human potential. I think everybody's on that journey. So before I start the talk today, let's play the video. Video in? So today I want to talk about the first topic, building confidence, because the lack of confidence is what will hold back for enterprises to adopt AI at a scale with a competitive or the opportunity cost associated with it. So we have to go back to the 1940s when a group of scholars from a range of fields, scientists, maths, engineers, start to explore the opportunity to create a digital or an artificial brain. It was in those days when a group of anthropologists and scientists, Isaac Asimov, for instance, start to analyze the ethical implications of doing that. The ethical implications, as I mentioned, of doing that. Today, the topic of ethical AI and the interest and public search is exploding. We just need to see Google trends and the terms around all responsible AI, safety in AI, ethical AI. All these terms are going kind of a skyrocket. With one exception, trusted AI. That term, if you see, seems to be held back. So why trust is not a frame that is valid anymore for a generative kind of AI context? Well, it's important to understand that this technology is probabilistic. It is not deterministic, with new risks coming with it. Probabilistic means that not the same inputs always provide the same outputs. Even look at these prompts. Just a minor change in a comma or a spelling creates a complete different outcome. So that variety in terms of output is not tolerated in certain and high sensitive scenarios. Imagine like an emergency room or the development of drugs. There are situations in which this uncertainty can't be tolerated. So while this technology has been compared with the fire, with internet, etc., there's still a large number of use cases that are being untouched, specifically in financial services or health, where this represents like 40% of the GDP. So what are the things, how to ensure the right AI governance, the right AI frameworks to unlock the potential of this technology? That's the question to be answered. 3 recommendations. First is awareness. We are clear that this technology is here to stay and the transformative power of it. Boards and executives, they need to understand, they need to have a deeper understanding of the technology itself and the new risk associated with it. The second thing, they need to create an environment for responsible AI development, looking at 5 key attributes. The first one, resilience. Data needs to be safe, securitized, even protected for the new threat of synthetic data. It needs to be unbiased, and there are techniques like reinforced learning, for example, or fine-tuning that can work to eliminate those biases. Explainability to a certain level of or a confidence interval to understand what algorithms are being used and what is behind the decision-making. Still, human judgment is important. That's why we prefer to talk about augmented intelligence rather than artificial intelligence. Transparency. Citizens and clients need to understand when they are interacting with an AI rather than with a human. And ultimately, performance, that level of uncertainty, it needs to be reduced. And there are techniques as well, a lot of efforts put into it, like adversarial networks or models that fact-checked the outputs of the first one. And the last element is about staying close to the ecosystem. That is critical. All this tsunami started there. The closer we are to the ecosystem, the better we will understand how this technology and the possibilities associated with it evolve. At EY, we've deployed, as you see, EY.ai, a unifying platform that is less about building trust and more about building safety and confidence. Thank you.
Please welcome Bloomberg's Tom Mackenzie.
Hello, I am delighted to be with all of you today here at the Bloomberg Technology Summit. Thank you for being with us. I hope you've enjoyed the morning sessions as much as I have. Writers, artists, and musicians are both intrigued and shocked by the power of generative AI services. Will it harm arts and culture or become a vital part of the creative toolkit? Our next panel is going to try and answer these very questions. So please join me in welcoming Hilary Crane, Chief Legal Officer, Creative Artist Agency, Victor Riparbelli, Chief Executive Officer, Synthesia, Oleg Stavitsky, Chief Executive Officer and co-founder, Endel, and Tom Mackenzie, anchor, Bloomberg Television in real life.
Welcome, everyone. And yes, that was the digital avatar version of me, created by the team at Synthesia. We just been having a very lively debate in the green room, and we're going to help and hope, I should say, to recreate this and that debate on stage. So very pleased to say we have a fantastic panel, as you can see. And I'm just going to briefly get the three individuals here to introduce themselves and what they do. So Hilary, let's start with you. This is all about the creative industries. And I think for most people, on lay people, when they think about AI, I think the creative industries probably comes front of mind in terms of where the disruption may land. Hilary, you are very much within that world, the creative agency industry, CAA. Talk to us about what you do and some of your clients and how this is folding into your thinking.
Sure. Thank you for having me. Yes, I'm the Chief Legal Officer for Creative Artist Agency, and as many of you may know, we're the leading agency in the world for actors, musicians, sports figures, you name it. We have an enviable client base of many people you know and recognize, and we're leaning into this heavily. Why? Because our clients care deeply, and some of them are on the concerned side of the house, and some of them are in the how quick can I get in and see where this is going to lead me side of the house. It's as diverse a client base as you could possibly imagine, and so we're leaning in to make sure we understand it, that we represent them, and that we can help create the circumstances that will allow this to become a really dynamic tool for the creative industries without becoming an existential threat to them. That's basically the balance we're seeking.
Victor, what is Synthesia? What do you and the team do when you're not having to build an avatar of me? What is the focus of the business?
Well, we build a lot of avatars.
Yeah.
So Synthesia is the world's largest AI video platform. We help the enterprise communicate better with video. So our technology is able to create videos like the one you saw with Tom before. We work with 47% of the Fortune 100, a lot of training, sales enablement, customer support types of use cases, where our customers want to elevate a piece of text into video, which is a much better means of communication. One of the things I find interesting about AI really is that I think it's going to be the great democratizer. In our little world, what you're seeing on the screen behind you right now is how our tool works. And as you can probably tell, it's very, very easy to use, right? Previously, the barriers to creating video content in an enterprise would be you have to know how to operate a camera, how to write a script, how to do all these things that traditionally are really hard and would have to go through a video production department. With this type of technology, we can enable anyone in the company to become a video creator in just a few seconds. If you know how to make a PowerPoint, you'll understand how to use our tools. We're very focused on the enterprise landscape. That's where we put most of our efforts. But I think in general, with creative AI technologies, it is going to be the great democratizer. We're going to see people today who have great YouTube channels, but are pretty kind of simple in the content they can make. They'll be able to create Hollywood-style content, which will create a barrage of new, exciting content. And I do think the biggest impact of the creative industry is going to be less about replacing actors, IP questions. I think it's going to more be a war for attention, where all of a sudden, people who previously just had a YouTube channel, they'll be able to produce much more interesting, much more rich content, kind of like they do in Hollywood, right? They'll create competition for eyeballs, less than they'll create, specific questions around how, actors, for example, will operate in this new world. So I think a lot of the focus, I think, is a little bit misguided, actually, if you take a 5 or 10 year time horizon.
Yeah, and we want to unpack that in a bit more detail. But before we do that, Oleg, you, the team at Endel, what is the business focused on? What do you do?
We have built this proprietary, patented, scientifically generated AI technology that produces functional music at scale. And when I say functional music, I primarily mean soundscapes that are designed to put you in a certain cognitive state, like concentration, relaxation, meditation, sleep. So what our technology does, it creates this type of content at scale. And this technology powers the app. There's Endel, the app that is available across all platforms out there. Download the app. It's the best sleep you'll ever get. Thank me later. But that very same technology is used to produce static, pre-recorded soundscapes that we publish ourselves and with a lot of partners that we're going to be talking about later today on the DSPs, on streaming platforms. So there's Endel, the artist, and there's Endel, the app.
Okay, Endel the artist and Endel the app. Let's get to the key question then, in terms of how disruptive your technologies are going to be to the world that Hillary lives in and the people that she represents. Victor, let's start with you, because you touched on Hollywood. How disruptive is not just the work of Synthesia, but generally generative AI going to be for the creative industries that is valued at, on some accounts, $14 billion just in the US? And what does that disruption look like?
So I think there's many analogies in history we can look at here, right? I think the advent of computers and the internet enabled anyone to very quickly create text, like write things and share them with the world, right? So if you look at the book industry or even the news industry, right? I think what happened more than anything was that all of a sudden there's a lot more choice for the consumers. And that means that their attention is much more diffuse than just on reading books that have been published by, you know, a big publishing house, or watching one TV channel that everybody in the UK has, something like that. So I think that's the mechanic we're going to see here as well. I think people are going to be able to produce much more with much less. And I think that's going to be the really big thing that we're going to see with this. I mean, music has gone through the same thing. There was a time where you had to have instruments to produce music, right? I can open my MacBook today and I can synthesize a 65-piece orchestra because we can sample and synthesize sounds. Now we're going to be able to sample, synthesize, you know, types of content that previously you'd have to have millions of dollars of budget for in Hollywood. You need actors, cameras, visual effects. So I think that's going to be on a long timeline, like let's say 5 or 10 years. I think that's going to be that's going to be the dynamic that's going to play out. It's going to enable anyone to create anything that they can imagine, and I think that's a good thing. I think the best ideas are going to win, and I think there's still going to be people who will be way better at storytelling and you know making content that are in Hollywood and are professionals that have done this for their entire life. They'll just be able to create more and get from idea to a piece of content faster.
Okay, that's a relatively benign vision if you're sitting there as someone who within talent, within movies or music or the music industry. Oleg, does that kind of align with your vision? How much chaos are you going to be causing in the music industry in the years ahead?
That's a good one. I mean, look, we're already working with a lot of artists, and you know, I think the narrative has changed over the past few years, because we started back in 2018, and in 2019 there was this partnership that we have announced with Warner Music that was mistakenly kind of called, that people said that we signed a recording deal with Warner Music, but it was just a distribution deal. But you know, not a lot of people understand the difference between the two. So basically the headlines were saying the end is nigh, and the algorithm just signed the deal with a major music label. Yeah, so people were going nuts about this. Fast forward to today, I think there's way less pushback, and actually because we have already worked with a lot of established artists like Grimes, James Blake, Miguel, and others, artists themselves are much more open to actually experimenting with this technology because they see an opportunity rather than a threat.
Are they, Hillary, or is Brad Pitt one of the members of your portfolio? Brad Pitt, Reese Witherspoon, are they quaking in their boots at the idea of generative AI taking their jobs?
So I'm sure it'll surprise you. I'm not going to talk about any specific talent today and what their point of view is. As I said in my opening, I think there's a really wide array of perspectives on this. But our point of view is that this is an exciting new tool of creativity. And I think we should, I mean, there's no putting the genie back in the bottle. It is here, and it's here to stay, and it's going to move us forward. And just like advancements previously, photography overtaking painting, moving pictures overtaking animation. I mean, we've seen this before, and every time you get kind of an explosion in new creativity without killing the thing that went before it. I think what has people concerned here is whether the machines are being trained on information that is legally owned by other people who don't consent to it being used in that way, and therefore are being monetized without their consent and often their knowledge. And then the flip side of that is, I think, something we can all recognize, which is the use of deep fakes without people's consent or knowledge, so that an individual is forced, without even knowing it, to show up in something they would never consent to be in. And so I think he got some issues on the front end in terms of what's being taken in to train the machines, and I think you have other issues on the part that spits it out. in terms of whether you're infringing on somebody's name, image, likeness, voice, ability to control their own destiny. I mean, I really want to make the point to you that artists say no to a lot of things in their career in order to cultivate who they are and how they appear in the world. And if somebody else can just log into a machine and say, as happened a couple weeks ago, say, let's create a fake Tom Hanks and have him advertise dental insurance, you're doing grave damage to Tom Hanks and a 40-year career of hard decisions. So I think that's where the touch points are. We're not anti this technology. Anything that adds to the creative toolkit is a positive for creativity. And I would hasten to add that real people are still much better at these things. Books written by great authors are much better than books written by ChatGPT, and the same is true of video and maybe to a lesser extent music, but also music.
Ooh, touching a nerve there.
No, it's just that there's so much in music that cannot be individual and is just the exploitation of the instruments as opposed to an individual's voice or an individual's style. That's all I meant by that.
Yeah, but also a question is for how long, I guess, and that's dependent on the changes and the development of the technology. And obviously, when most people think of A-list stars like Tom Hanks, they obviously also think of A-list stars like Tom McKenzie. And I asked...
yes.
I say that in jest, obviously. And I actually interviewed my digital avatar that Synthesia created, and the responses were using ChatGPT-4. So I think we have a clip of me asking about my job prospects, because obviously I work in the fairly aged medium of TV. So we can, I think, play the clip and see what ChatGPT or my digital avatar had to say in response to that.
Human TV anchors bring unique qualities such as charisma, critical thinking, and adaptability. So, rest assured, I'm here to assist, not to take your place.
Yeah, questionable, clearly, on the charisma front. So I've probably got 3 to 6 months, I think, based on that. Look, Victor, I know that you have views in terms of the questions around copyright and where those lines should be drawn as we look at some of these big models. Where do you think it lands? Do you agree with Hillary that we need to prescribe what is copyrighted, what goes into the models, and what comes out the other end, how we think about that?
So I think there's a very black and white line around consent and your digital likeness, and I don't even think that should be a conversation that we're having. And I think a lot of those kind of instances, right, would already be legal today. Obviously, you should not be allowed to take someone's likeness and produce an advertisement. I think that's a very hard line. We have a lot of safety guards on our platform. Everything is fully consensual and so on. I think where the more interesting question for me is around what are you allowed to train these models on, right? So you have one camp who is saying you're not allowed to put anything that's copyrighted or owned by anyone else into these models, even if what the model spits out is not infringing on copyright. So this would be putting Mickey Mouse cartoons into the model, and then it spits out cartoons of a green frog walking around the forest, right? Where maybe it's sort of inspired to some extent, but it's definitely not infringing on copyright directly, but may indirectly be. So that's one camp. Then the other camp, who are like the AI maximalists, who will say, this is what humans do, right? We can't make computers blind and deaf and just say the computer is not allowed to look at any content. They just have to have everything kind of intrinsically. So do we regulate what you put into the models and if you're allowed to train a copyrighted material, or do we regulate on the outcome of the models? And that's a very interesting question. I don't have a strong POV. I don't really have a horse in the race here. But that's the thing that's interesting to me, right? When can we say that content created has enough residue of some copyrighted content for it to be infringing on someone's rights? And that's a question that's been around in the creative industry for a long while. Like we were talking about in the green room around, artists who take a chord progression or a melody or a specific style of singing that's inspired by someone else. They sometimes get litigated, right? Someone say, hey, you stole that melody from me. And they get sued and they have to pay up some money. So I think that's the question. And I think the consent question, I hope, is not going to be a question. I think that's very obvious. But I think this idea of what can you train the models on is hard. And maybe my last thing to add to that, which I also mentioned before, right? I think the interesting thing with a lot of these new technologies we've seen the last 12 months is that you literally cannot build them without training on extremely large data sets, right? So this would be ChatGPT is trained on like, I think 30% of the internet. Some of these new music generators are trained on, I don't know, like millions of hours of music, right? And so in those cases, it becomes practically very difficult if you have to get permission for every single piece of content. And so that I think that just muddies the discussion even more, makes it very hard. But I don't have a strong POV on what, I can see both sides of the argument, to be honest.
The point you're making is that there would not be an open AI or a stable diffusion if you had to, if all of that input had to be copyrighted.
Exactly.
And you just wouldn't have those models, and you wouldn't have all the different applications you could build on those models as a result. Do you agree with that, Ole, that to some extent you have to open the gates around copyright in order to get to the advancements and the innovations that many would like to see?
When it comes to music, there's two types of models that we need to be talking about, right? Like the so-called foundational models, the quality of which is definitely determined by the quality of this large data set that is being ingested, right? Like that is very, very clear. And a lot of these models out there are currently trained on tens of thousands of hours of stock music, and therefore they sound like very, very talented stock musicians, right? Like, so that's the thing. And I think the winner is going to be whoever is going to train the so-called foundational model on tens of thousands of hours of copyrighted material. And that has not happened as of today, right? Like, and then you have kind of specific models. That's what we do. Our model is actually trained on our content that we have created, because that model is laser focused on functional music specifically. So what we do today, right now, the way our technology works is we take the stems from artists, we ingest them into our system, and actually it analyzes it, and it creates new stems. Stems are like, individual components of a song, like you have like a bass or vocal or like a melody. And it creates new stems from the source stems, but it sort of endelifies everything it touches, right? Like, because our model is functional music specific. So it really depends on what kind of model we're talking. And I think at the end of the day, what we're going to have is we're going to have these large foundational models for music, and we're going to have genre and artist-specific models.
Interesting. Hillary?
So the whole idea of copyright is that if a creative person creates something and goes to the trouble of protecting it under the law, that they have the ability to control where and how it's used. And we are seeing now the development of models in the commercial sense that are not all the way to where OpenAI are, where people are willing to give indemnities because they're training the models in ethical ways. And they're saying the only thing we're using to train these models is data we have or we've gotten the legitimate rights to. And I think where we're going to see this go is some competition in the models if users can get their heads around demanding that what they use not be based on stolen goods. I completely appreciate that often you can come up with a better product if you steal from other people. Okay, it doesn't make it right. Publicly available on the internet is not the same thing as legally available for use. And so the question really becomes, if these models and the corporations that are creating them are creating commercial advantage for themselves by wholesale using stolen copyrighted material of other people, are we as a broad world society going to accept that as an ethical matter? And then country by country, what are our laws going to do? And historically, we know this, and you don't have it here, but in the US, there's something called fair use, which is if there's a copyrighted material and I want to go make something that is, let's say, a satire based on that material, fair use. I'm doing something new, even though it's inspired by something that already exists. Those are difficult calls to make. We've been making them for scores of years, if not centuries. So I think the fact that it's difficult isn't a reason to throw out what we've all kind of agreed to and is the basis of the laws that exists today. So I think we're going to see through competition whether or not the world cares about ethical training, because law and legislation is trailing technology, which should surprise none of us, because that's always what happens.
Victor, do you agree that that competition is going to take place? And do you think the ethics will matter? Or how concerned are you that innovation will be held back if maybe you follow that view around the needs of copyright?
Well, I think, I think the question here is more nuanced than I think the creative industry usually portrays it at. I think, for me, I always think back to, if I sit with 5 of my friends and we just listen to a lot of music from someone, and then we make something that's fundamentally new, I think everyone in this room would agree that that's okay, right? As long as I'm not infringing on copyright. And I think that's the question of, do we view humans as being different than machines in this context? If I have my machine look at a lot of different music and output something, I totally get the argument for it. And it's not because I take a stance for and against, but I think it is more nuanced than just stealing content. I think in terms of competition, I think what we will see with this style of training, right, is that all the value will then incur to all the incumbents, right? Because Getty Images, Adobe, the record labels, they have the data, and they're the only ones who have the data. And maybe that's fair, but that'll 100% stifle innovation, right? Because it means that basically most startups will die on the way to getting there, or they will have to partner with these big companies to get access to that data. So I think, this is a space where there's a lot of incentives, and I think the incentives are also important to be understood. You have the startups who obviously are interested in more open copyright laws, because that will help them, and you have the big incumbent companies who are not interested in it, both because of I think, generally moral questions around it, for sure, but also because it is a means of kind of capture to some extent, right? And I think that's also, I think that the litigation in the US will be very interesting to see how that kind of pans out and what the courts deem to be ultimately best for society, right? Do we want to have these technologies with a few companies where it's done in the right way? Do we respect that more than the innovation that will happen from kind of like the grassroots style movement if we open up these laws, right? And as I said many times now, I generally don't know what the right answer is, but I think for me that is the kind of discussion that the world is out.
How do you stop your digital avatars becoming deep fakes?
Well, so we have consent in place for, we never create any avatars without explicit consent, right? So you have to literally, sign a contract saying you're okay with your avatar being created. And there's a KYC style process that goes into making an avatar. So for us, I think, again, consent around your likeness, and I also think responsibility for making sure your technology is not misused, for me, is completely black and white. Like, we employ lots of content moderation, AI safety, and we take consent very seriously, and I think that should be the baseline for anything we do with AI. For me, the interesting question, again, is around the training data, right? Because I think that's much more nuanced, and I think comes with lots of different trade-offs. I don't see removing consent as part of any product to be good for the world. Like, I just don't see why that would ever be the case.
Oleg, how much of a threat are you to Spotify?
I mean, I would like to think that to some extent...
You're making them sweat a bit.
God, is there anyone from Spotify in the room?
Daniel Ek is just sitting
there. I mean, look, I think definitely when it comes to functional music, that category on the DSPs, not just on Spotify, in general, we all know that a lot of this content is, rain sounds, ocean sounds, dishwasher sounds, and we have hundreds of millions of people listening to this type of content.
Wait a minute, dishwasher sounds?
Dishwasher sounds.
That's a thing?
It's a huge thing, actually. Fan sounds. Yeah, because it's essentially white noise, and it helps you go to sleep. It's just because neuroscience. Right? So a lot of people are listening to this type of content, and what we've seen over the past few years is this category growing massively in this direction, and the major labels have been ignoring this category for a very, very long time. They've been like, okay, that's fine. You want to listen to rain sounds, go listen to that. But now this category is estimated at 15 billion streams a month across all platforms and channels. That is if you look at top 5 most popular, most consumed, most subscribed to playlists on Spotify, all of them are going to be like sleep, deep sleep, concentration, things like that. And a lot of that content is not artist-driven and not label-driven content. So here comes Endel, and we're saying, well, we think there must be an alternative to that. We think there's room for high-quality, premium, artist-driven, functional music that is created at scale using our technology.
Okay, we're going to come back to you in just the next couple of seconds. I'm going to be deeply unfair. We've got a couple of minutes left on the clock that we need to preserve for something, an announcement. But before we get there, I'm going to be very unfair and ask you briefly to give us your views on what an appropriate regulatory response is to generative AI. Hillary, I'll start with you.
Wow, that's a big question.
It is.
For a little time. I think an appropriate response would be to, first of all, legislate and clearly state what Victor was just talking about, is that consent is an absolute requirement. That's not well established everywhere. As much as we like to think that that's a bright line, people are not acting like it's a bright line. So number one, I think that should be the case. Number two, I think we should get clarity on the use of copyrighted material for training and what's in and what's out. And right now, we're relying on the court system to do that. That'll take a couple of years. Probably be better if we got something faster out of the legislative bodies, but I'm not sure that that's going to happen.
Okay, Victor.
I totally agree, and I actually think that the most important thing is just that we get some guidelines. As I said, I think it can go either direction, but right now we're basically letting it up to companies themselves to interpret copyright legislation in the way that they see fit. Some will lean forward and break more copyright laws to get faster ahead on product development. Some will stand back and try and do the more ethical thing. And I think we just need to get the rules in place, right? No matter what direction they go, because that makes the playing field much more even.
Okay. Oleg, I'm not going to ask you about regulation, but I am going to ask you about your announcement and your partnership. Talk to us about the importance of what you're announcing.
So what I was just talking about, right? We are partnering, or have been partnering with artists all over the world to create kind of functional soundscape versions of their music. And earlier this year, we have announced strategic partnerships with Universal Music and Warner Music to work with all of their catalog, I mean, any music that is on their catalog, to turn that into functional soundscapes. And today, we're actually announcing a deal that we're doing with Rhino, which is a Warner Music label. We've reimagined Roberta Flack's iconic song, Killing Me Softly, that turns 50 this year as 3 soundscapes. And yeah, we get to listen to it now.
Very cool.
There we go. The power of generative AI with consent. With consent.
Yes.
Thank you all very much. I think you'll agree. Fantastic panelists. Really appreciate your time. We ran over by a minute, but I think it was worth it. Hillary Crane, thank you very much from CAA. Victor Ripabelli from Synthesia. And Olev Stavisky from Endel. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
This is a traditional prosthetic we get today. You can see it's rigid, it can be uncomfortable, heavy, complicated tools, and they take a really long time to get. What we make is more like clothes. So they're soft, they're really light, they've got simple tools. One of the things that you can do with having soft, flexible prosthetics is you can make them very small, very light, and you can make them for kids. And they literally are designed to be like toys, but also kind of a little kid's first foray into prosthetics in a way that is actually fun and enjoyable and not scary. When the pandemic happened, we started getting people from all over the world because their clinics were shut down. And so suddenly we realized, like, oh, okay, well now we have something, without realizing it, we're the only prosthetic that you can put in the post and send to people. which is perfect for if you can't meet them in real life. So that took us onto this whole path of working in like conflict zones or in countries where resources are really strapped, it's really hard to get around. And when you do something like that, the link is so close. You can make something on Monday, give it to them on Tuesday, and then see immediately, oh yeah, that's actually made my life a little bit easier. And that feeling is, wow. So to do that at scale, to be able to say that we as a group have done, we've nudged the needle on a large amount of people's lives, yeah, that would be nice to say.
So we make our technology available through a couple of different mechanisms. First, through Google products, because we have this sister company relationship with Google. Also, the part of Google DeepMind that I work in is called Google DeepMind Institute. And our area is specifically devoted to working with third parties, like NGOs, nonprofits, and trying to solve global challenges. So we give our technology open access to these groups and really try to solve challenges in a responsible way to communities that might have less access traditionally to those, high-tech solutions.
Please welcome to the stage Sims Witherspoon, Climate and Sustainability Lead at Google DeepMind, with Bloomberg's Jackie Davalos and Nate Lankson.
Like we never left.
It's like we never went anywhere. Hello. So the clip that you have just seen is a very special treat. That is an upcoming clip from an episode of the Bloomberg Originals show that Jackie and I co-host, AI IRL, now in its second season. Very, very happy about that. And the conversation that we had on that episode that's going to come out next month was with Sims, who is joining us today because she was so interesting. We thought, well, let's do this actually IRL in real life on a stage here. So it's amazing that we've got you here. Now, before we jump into what we want to talk about, we do have a poll, which hopefully you guys have been doing plenty of and we can get up on screen. The question we wanted to ask is, do you think AI will help or hinder humanity's effort to tackle climate change? You have a range of options. I'm hoping you don't choose the middle one because that's boring. Definitely help, maybe help in the future. Not convinced either way. You can see those. Please vote. And it was interesting because I think it was in the first poll, right? They said where AI can make the most impact, and it was healthcare.
But you've already heard about some of the exciting things going on in clean tech, so perhaps the audience might be a little bit more optimistic.
Yeah, that's my hope. I can't see them because the lights are so bright.
Eventually,
but they seem, the ones in the front look pretty optimistic. So we're going to get some results in. And then we'll make a comment about them. Here we go. Excellent. Right, that's dream scenario A, Jackie, dream scenario A. Fantastic. Well, let's get on. This is a chat show. Let's chat.
Okay, well, let's take a step back because a lot of people know Google's DeepMind as the company that developed a system to beat the board game Go. Can you explain how DeepMind went from doing that to climate science?
Yeah, of course. So AlphaGo was a system that we developed that hopefully folks are familiar with, but games are a really interesting place to test AI because they have very clear goals, success metrics, clear benchmarks, and lots of data. And so that's the kind of system that is really interesting for AI because it's a perfect test bed. And one of the things that was really interesting about AlphaGo is that even though it's a game we've been playing for hundreds of years, using an AI system actually taught us new information that we didn't know about the game before. And we've really expanded this idea into other systems like AlphaFold, for instance. AlphaFold is a system that takes in amino acid sequences and tells us how proteins are folded. We developed a database that basically works like Google search for proteins, and we were able to give that to the research community in order to further their research. So if you look at kind of the development of systems like AlphaFold, you can see that some of the scientists that might use that would understand proteins. For instance, if they're engineering enzymes, we actually do work with a partner who is looking into enzymes that biodegrade plastics and are able to do their work more quickly because they have access to the library that AlphaFold provides.
DeepMind CEO is a big Atari fan, so moral of the story is let your kids play video games.
I mean, the answer to how do you go from AlphaGo to climate science is, well, you just go via, 200 million protein. Which is great. So, in the episode that you're in next month, we take a very global view because it's a global show. But we're here in the UK with our fantastic climate and weather. It's lovely today. So, can you tell us about something you've done here that you've seen and that is going to excite everybody?
Yeah, we'll talk about the weather, since the UK loves talking about especially rainfall, so maybe I'll go with that example. We did a partnership with the Met Office, particularly working with some of their expert meteorologists looking at heavy rainfall, because heavy rainfall is what causes damage to people and property. And so we developed a system that was a generative AI system. So effectively, you can think about it, when you look at the weather and you see those, beautiful pictures on screen with lots of colors of like where rain is going to happen, like where it's going to be heavy, where it's going to be light, how it's going to move throughout the UK. And we basically fed that radar data to our system, and it watched it like a movie, effectively, and predicted the next frame. So we were able to, this is something we call precipitation nowcasting. So it's the forecasting for 2 hours ahead of time, so very short-term for forecasting. And we worked with the Met Office to do this. They were an incredible partner because actually 99% of the country here in the UK is covered by the radar data we needed in order to build these systems. If you compare that to the country where I'm from, the United States, only 73% of the contiguous United States is covered by that same data. So it was much easier for us to work here with the Met Office and also a partner who is willing to contribute all of their domain expertise to working with our machine learning researchers.
I mean, weather forecasting as well has got so much further than when I was a kid and I used to pretend I was ill to get out of school. See, like Michael Fish floating on a virtual UK outside of ITV's headquarters. I don't know if anyone remembers that. It's like the most bizarre approach to talking about the weather.
Days are over, Nate.
I know, it's crazy.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about that data. How do you get companies to give up that data? Do you have to persuade them to install sensors or some other kind of equipment? How does that kind of partnership work?
That's a really good question. So it varies by the type of problem we're working on, but the main way that we work on data accessibility with partners is really just trust. So we go in and we talk about the problems that they have and the problems that they're trying to solve, what the solutions need to look like, and how they're going to use them. Because without those sorts of partnerships and without that conversation, we might be building something that doesn't get used, and that's not the point, especially when you're talking about climate and sustainability applications. So the trust is, I think, the biggest part of that. And once you figure out, once you build the relationship and you decide on a problem you're going to sort out together, you can see what pieces of information need to feed into that. So if we think about the Met partnership, the things we needed to do that project were radar data, which the Met delivers through its data licensing process at every 5 minutes on a feed that gives you 1 kilometer resolution. And the metric they use for the data is atmospheric moisture 1 millimeter per hour. So it's all of the data we really needed. And when we built that partnership, we were able to understand that with them and get access to it through their processes. So,
Jackie, would you trust DeepMind to put sensors on your building?
If they can be that exact, and if I know exactly how it's being used, maybe not. Maybe so. I think it just kind of depends, like you said, on the trust and where, some of the trust has been before in a company like DeepMind, given you guys already have made such strides, especially with protein folding prediction. I'd love to see what you guys do in the climate space.
Well, I want to talk a little bit about surprises because I love a surprise. And I have seen someone jump out of a cake once, which was that was a surprise for everyone. They didn't know I was going to do that. So you must see surprises a lot. You've talked about the Met Office, obviously. You work with academics, you work with companies and partners, and I'm kind of curious to get a sense of the kind of surprises that you stumble upon. And if I can give you an example of my favorite surprise that I know happened at DeepMind, it was this Move 37. in AlphaGo. You know, it's well worth looking up. There's probably an entire article about this one move, because it was this move in the game that realistically no human would ever have made, because it was nuts, it was crazy. But it was like this first moment where we thought, it's doing something, but the creators didn't know. They were like, we didn't expect that.
Yeah.
You know, like jumping out of a cake at someone's wedding. Like, they didn't know that was going to happen. So does that kind of thing happen in your side of the fence in climate as well?
Absolutely. That's that piece of new knowledge where AI systems can teach us things that we didn't know before. I'll never forget one of the first projects I was working on with DeepMind. It was an industrial optimization project, and we were trying to help a really, really large facility reduce the energy that was required for cooling it. And in this facility, the cooling was run by like these 3 massive chillers. I mean, we're talking about chillers the size of school buses. Do they have those here in the UK?
We have schools here.
Okay, so no, school buses.
School buses.
And they're massive. And the way that they'd always run them is that they would start one of the massive chillers, run it to max capacity. When they needed a second, turn that one on, run it to max, and so on and so forth. And when we started running our AI system, you know, the moment we kind of turned it on, so to speak, the very first recommendation it delivered was turn off all the chillers. And we kind of looked around at each other and we were like, oh, that sounds a little sketchy, but we do trust the system, so, you know, what do you think? Because you turn to your partners at that point. I mentioned the domain experts we work with. In this instance, they were the facility managers. And we were like, you know, ultimately up to you all, what do you think? And I remember she looked around and she was like, let's do it. So we turned off all the chillers. The very next recommendation of the AI system was to turn all of the chillers on at the lowest capacity possible. So what it had effectively learned through the sensor information across the industrial system was it was actually much more efficient to turn every single one of those industrial-sized chillers on at low capacity than it was to turn one on at a time, max it out. And that was a new piece of information. They had never tried that before. We all, including the domain experts, were looking around at each other like, is this a good idea? But ultimately, it was a new piece of information that they then continued to use. So that was definitely a surprise. We were nervous.
Speaking of those chillers, AI is also known to be quite energy intensive. Could you maybe talk about what the net impact of the technology that DeepMind is developing in the climate space, what that can actually be, and how you're kind of measuring success along the way?
Yeah, so how we measure success for the projects I work on, again, it's very project dependent. So you work with domain experts to figure out how they measure success and their problems. The problems that I'm specifically working on right now involve climate change mitigation. So we measure that very much by CO2e, so carbon equivalence, and the reduction that we can get in CO2e emissions. And so, but the metric will change depending on your project. I think that if I step back and I think about your overall question around how do we at Google DeepMind think about the environmental impact of AI, we really do three things. The first thing is that we make sure our house is in order, so to speak. You know, we look at our carbon footprint, we look how to run our experiments as carbon efficiently as possible. We also then, the second thing is we develop products that help other people with their energy efficiency. And the third thing is that we are working on breakthrough technologies that we hope will accelerate our transition to net zero. Because ultimately, you know, any carbon-intensive technology, AI included, will have a carbon footprint, or any energy-intensive technology, any energy-intensive technology will have a carbon footprint until the grid is run on carbon-free energy. And that's just a fact. So we kind of have to do all three of those components to work towards that eventual outcome.
I mean, you were saying something backstage about, you know, being able to deploy an AI process onto a green grid at Google. Like, how does that work?
Yeah, so one of the really interesting models that Google has developed for their own compute is that the compute that can wait, so that doesn't need to be immediately sent to production, can kind of gets put in a queue, and you can move it in space and time to where the greenest grids are. So let's just say for whatever reason, the UK was really carbon intensive when I wanted to run my experiment. I could just choose to run it an hour later in Norway where the grid was very green. So I think that system is so cool and a really interesting use of AI for sustainability.
So, I mean, we're talking about making a difference, but how do you know when to move on? I don't want to say failure. You'll probably call it sunsetting a project. But I mean,
PR speak.
Yeah, I mean, I learned some of my best lessons through failing.
Yeah.
I refer you to the cake example. So, like, how do you know when to say this isn't working? Well, let's move on.
Yeah, so Google DeepMind is a science organization, and so we're an R&D company at heart. And I think that the way we think about failures are really about learnings, and the scientific process is incredibly iterative. So if we plan out a piece of research, and we have these things called milestones where we expect to achieve certain bits of research or certain bits of progress, we kind of check in at those points and we say, hey, are our hypotheses still true? Are we still working towards the direction that will create positive impact? If not, how do we shift and pivot, or how do we get around obstacles? So you might call that, failure mode or sunsetting an idea, but I think for us, it's really about how we pivot research, how we come at it at another angle, how we approach it with maybe a new AI architecture, and so how we adjust and iterate as we move forward. And we do those by checking in at those regular milestones and just having really honest conversations with ourselves and with lots of different experts around the table.
Take us into the DeepMind lab when you are kind of creating this climate technology. What are you guys doing back there? I mean, how much different is it now incorporating all of these new AI tools that wasn't necessarily possible before?
This is what we call the can you take us into the day in the life of Sims Witherspoon, please? And how much of it is spent in a lab coat? Because in my head, it's a lot of people in lab coats looking at computer screens going.
Yeah, someone mentioned that AI isn't just for the nerds anymore. I think it was the Anthropic founder. So what does it look like for you?
Well, they made me take my lab coat off and brush my hair as soon as I walked in the door downstairs. But aside from that, no, it is, it's an incredibly interesting place to work. I think that, people assume that it's full of, only scientists. But the fact of the matter is we do have research scientists. We have scientists like myself who were trained in different domains that were not machine learning, who are now doing, product type jobs. We have communications experts and policy specialists and ethicists and, responsibility folks. And so it really is a lot of different individuals with a variety of skill sets and a diversity of backgrounds. And I would say that, if you're walking down the corridors of Google DeepMind, it is absolutely true that you pass loads of whiteboards and people huddle around the whiteboards and marking things up in different colors and kind of debating different ideas. And I haven't been to the office today, so I don't have any whiteboard marks on my hands yet. But that absolutely is true. I think to your question, Jackie, around how we're going about, creating this technology, one of the things that we do is we use this triage process where we look at all of the things that will have what we believe is global impact on climate change mitigation or adaptation or addressing loss and damage. And then we look at the subsection of things that ML can really affect. Because climate change is an economic problem, it's a socio-political issue, it's a science and technology problem, but ML is not the right tool for all of those areas, right? It is a very powerful tool for a very specific set of problems. And so we then dive into where ML can really help. And I know in the episode we talked about kind of this 3-part framework, but maybe I'll just leave that as a teaser. Yeah, I know, it's a teaser.
Well, on that note, I'm a little curious about, all of these technologies being developed, who gets access to them? You mentioned that you came at Office, but there's also a commercial component to this, but you guys also have partnerships where you don't charge for some of this technology. Can you kind of walk us through how you make that decision?
Yeah, so it depends. We make the decision tech by tech, kind of application by application. And so, for instance, we were talking about AlphaFold earlier. We thought that it was incredibly important because we just don't have the capacity to take those 200 million proteins and actually do all of the research ourselves. So we thought it was really important to release that database to researchers across health sciences, climate, et cetera. And so the academic community has free and open access to the database. But at the same time, we also, for drug discovery regulatory and things like this, where you might be working with big pharma, for instance. We've spun off a company called Isomorphic Labs. Demis is also the CEO of that, where we will be able to have, the commercialization of that technology as well. So it's really a case-by-case basis. I think for climate tech, my team, our ultimate goal is always to open source, where it's safe and responsible to do so. It's not always the case. But we kind of assume that is our end goal, and we work directly from there. So any of the partners that we agree to work with, we say, hey, we ultimately want to make this widely available. We want to be able to develop generalized architectures that we can share. So when we work with you, we're going to take those learnings and build something that's generalizable. And then obviously, they own the models that are trained on their data, so that's all kept, behind that security wall. And then we move on to our additional applications.
Well, you mentioned the S word then, safety. I mean, we've got this UK AI Safety Summit
coming up
in like a week at Bletchley Park. Big focus is on safety. I don't know if you're going, but I mean, what would you hope that people then going to that would actually be talking about as it relates to your field?
Yeah, I think that, with climate sustainability, as well as like the rest of AI, we're really just scratching the surface of what our potential is with this technology. And so I think the Safety Summit is a really wonderful opportunity for folks and experts, from various fields to share the potentials, but also the risks of the technology, and just have a really open conversation about what that is and what we need to be able to do about it.
Is there something, just because we've got the last minute here, is there something that you think people here either don't know but really should, or something they probably do know but actually things have changed quite a bit?
No. Don't know but really should. I think that the first thing that comes to mind when I hear that is the data piece. So AI is not a plug-and-play technology. We start working with partners and they say, oh, we want AI to fix all these different problems. And when we start looking at the data, we actually realize there's a lot of legwork that needs to be done to get something kind of AI ready. So I think something that people don't know but should is that as soon as you decide that you want an AI application to solve a challenge that you have related to climate and sustainability, or really anything else, look at the data you have that you'll need in order to solve that problem, and make sure it is clean. And by that we mean it's accurate, it's unbiased, it's actually representative of the problem. Because sometimes that legwork can take months or even like a year, and you have to do it before you're working with AI systems. I think something that people know, but I don't know about should forget, but I think how about know but forget, is that AI is not a silver bullet. Like, it will not fix all problems related to climate change. I mentioned earlier, it's not even the right tool for a lot of the challenges we face in this space, but it is a really powerful tool that if we are able to wield it effectively, will have transformative impact for climate sustainability. So I'm really excited about it. I'm really glad everyone on the poll is as well.
So optimistic.
Yeah. And just as a reminder, it was scenario A, which is things are good. So that's good. Well, look, we're out of time. In fact, we're over by 56 seconds, so I'm going to get a beating in a little bit. But thank you. This has been amazing. I should remind everyone that if you did like this, including the look and the people, then in a month's time, Sims' episode of AI IRL will be airing. Go and follow Bloomberg Originals. Follow wherever you follow your things, and you'll see it. But Sims, it's been fantastic
to
have you on.
Again. Thank you so much for having me. It's such a treat to see you all.
Thank you. And lunch is now served.
We are the lunch.
Being a new parent is challenging enough, but many women also struggle with their physical and mental health after giving birth. Polling suggests that 2/3 of new mums quit their hobbies in the first year of breastfeeding or pumping, and almost half of mums reported losing their sense of self when feeding their babies.
It's such an important part of a woman's life when she's breastfeeding, and yet the technology that existed before our product, big, noisy, cumbersome, you're plugged into a wall, they felt humiliated. They often told us they felt like a cow. So we came up with the idea of why can't we design something, and this is LV Pump, that you can put it in your bra, so quiet, so discreet that nobody even knows you're pumping. And that was really the beginning of it all for us, because we're now on this journey where it's all about how can we empower women through radical female-first technology. So I quit my job and I started the company, and I didn't really have a clue what I was doing. I'd never even worked in the private sector. But there's enough people around you who are sort of teaching you, and we just knew we had to have laser focus on getting that product and trying to solve problems for women. And so along the way, the company has changed so much, and I think there's such a difference with how you lead a team at the beginning when it's really scrappy and you need to roll up your sleeves and problem solve everywhere. I look back on those early days and yeah, I didn't really sleep much. I also had a baby at home, but I loved that, right? And then as you get bigger, there's different sets of challenges now as we've gone from 50 people to 100 to 200 people and so on.